Hello, hello, hello. Hopefully this is working. I have no idea if it is. Oh, actually, that's a really bright light. I should probably turn that down. Yes. So, right. So everyone can obviously hear me. So, as you may well be aware, this is the live section of Patreon Drydock episode 197. Spoiler alert, the whirring you might be able to hear in the background is the computer desperately trying to render the recorded segment. And it's only rendering the first half because, well, let's just say a combination of jet lag and sleep debt basically wiped me out for the first 3 days or so. And pollen season has kicked off in the UK, as it has apparently the last week of me being in the US as well. So basically, I got nothing done for the first 3 days of getting back, other than lying in bed feeling sorry for myself and wondering when it would all end. So basically for the first time, I think in channel history, the Patreon Drydock is going to be uploaded in 2 segments. Part 1 goes up tonight, which will be released to the general public tomorrow morning, or tomorrow lunchtime UK time, and that will that's the first 3 hours, I think, and then the second half will be part 2, which will be next Sunday. So yeah, this is a small selection of my hat collection. So I tried to make a point of getting a hat for every ship. So we've got Midway. We have, what have we got? We've got Iowa. We have Salem. That was the first hat I got. And we have Wisconsin, the last hat that I got, because that was my last battleship journey. So there's a few more hats on their way. There's a box of stuff that I shipped back to myself, so that's on its way. That has hats from, let me think if I get this straight, it's got a hat from Constitution, it's got a hat from Yorktown, and there's the Yorktown one, the Constitution one, same one was there. Oh, and my New Jersey hat as well. So those 3 are in that box. And then Massachusetts, Alabama, and North Carolina, I need to order hats from them from overseas, because I meant to get hats for them, but we were on the ship for so long that the gift shop had shut by the time we finished, which was a bit silly. So yeah, at that point I will then have hats for every ship I visited, with the exception of Olympia, who have run out. So apologies if I sound slightly nasally at points, because I'm still fighting the pollen. I've loaded up on antihistamines, but that only has limited effect. And as you may or may not be able to tell, I don't know, depending on the resolution, yes, I still have my tan from the US, although it's annoyingly fading rather fast on my face. My arms are still quite well tanned. So yes, for those of you asking, yes, I will be at Tankfest, which is, a couple of months away now. And yes, I have Iron Brew, and I was kept well supplied with Iron Brew by you lot, wonderfully, while I was in the States. So that was absolutely fantastic. That kept me going. So anyway, let's get on with the Patreon questions. I'll get rid of that XSplit thing because that's annoying. Right, so let's get on with the Patreon questions first, and then we'll move on to any Super Chat questions that come on while I'm doing that, and then we'll move on to general questions and possibly a little bit of discussion of the America trip, although I do plan later on in the month, probably at the halfway stage maybe, or something like that, to... so not next week, maybe on the 21st, and then I'll do the next Patreon live stream on the 1st of June. So on the 21st, I'll do a live stream, which will be general Q&A, but also much more detailed reflections on the America trip informally, and there'll obviously be a video about the America trip generally. Probably as a fun Friday. And then over the next few months, there'll be obviously content from the various trips to the various ships that I did. So, yeah. Anyway, getting on with the Patreon questions. Colin Williams asks, at the surrender of the Regia Marina, they pledged to fight alongside the Allies, with the fast battleships being sent to operate under the watchful guns of the US Navy in the Pacific. To facilitate this, they will need refitting in America. America's anticipated this and begun to gather materials, aided by an enterprising Italian officer who's forwarded blueprints of the ships and shells ahead of time. Say for whatever reason the three Littorios managed to give the Luftwaffe the slip and make it to America unmolested, what do the refitted Littorios look like? And how does this refit change your ranking of the Littorios against other fast battleships? Could they be ready in time for the Philippine Sea? And if they somehow were, and Lee had potentially two or more fast battleships additional, would he be inclined to try and force a daytime engagement with the Japanese battle line? Could they have been ready in time for the Philippines Sea? Maybe technically, but they won't have been worked up by then. Unless it's an absolute minimal refit. So basically you're looking at two possible lines for this refit to go down, because they do have 3 ships. Option 1, which to be honest is probably the most likely, is going to be similar to what happened to Richelieu. So they'll probably have the same factory cook up a batch of shells for them, which may actually, solve a good chunk of their accuracy at long range issues. And then probably replace their light and medium AA fit with 20 and 40 millimeter guns. Stick some radar on there. Pretty much everything else will be left the same. So the 90mm secondaries, the 6.6-inch secondaries, and off it goes. That's probably the quickest, easiest, and fastest way of getting those ships back out into action at minimal cost. The other option would be to take them in for a much deeper refit, at which point you'd have to probably end up stripping out the 6.6s and probably all the 90mm, and then, given the size and location of the 90mm, you probably end up with replacing the 6.6s with twin 5-inch 38s, and then probably putting single 5-inch 38s in place of the 90s. That would be my offhand estimation. Maybe you could fit a few twin 538s, but I'm somewhat questionable on that. So probably single 5-inch 38s in place of the single 90s, probably in slightly more open mountings. And then, as I say, the twin 5-inch 38s at the 4 corners where the 6.6s are. Now that would make the ship a lot more compatible with US Navy support systems. The only thing they need to support then is the 15-inch shells separately. But that would take a lot more time and a lot more money and a lot more effort, so I doubt it would be done. I think the first option is probably the more likely of the two. And then it would, in terms of ranking the Littorios against other fast battleships, well, obviously her AA battery would get a lot better. And as far as everything else is concerned, it would probably depend on, the new American manufactured 15-inch shells. Do they solve that eternal question of how to make the Littorios consistently accurate? We'd have to wait and see. I'll just copy that across. Yeah, Maxim Machine Gun, they're noticing the shirt I have on there. Again, I don't know what resolution it's coming through to you guys in, but this is the Marilyn Thompson Collectors Association shirt, which might give you a clue as to one of the activities I got up to while I was in the States. Daleks are pointing out, yeah, the Littorio only has a short range for the Pacific, but to be fair, by the time it gets to the Pacific, which is going to be late 44, early 45, something like that, there are forward operational bases that substantially shorten the overall range that that is necessary for the ships to get to the front line. So, things like Ulithi and other forward operating bases, they could be usefully employed, I'm sure. Knight 6831 says, why in, I'm just going to pick this one up quickly, why in most alt history of World War II does always end up with the Royal Navy getting 4 vanguards? Okay. Because it's the most likely thing. The Royal Navy obviously was building the Lions. They had issues with the 16-inch guns, which is why they stopped building the Lions. Vanguard was able to make use of reconditioned 15-inch guns towards the end of World War II, mid to end of World War II. The older R-class and indeed even Malaya were beginning to show their age. So if they need battleships and they need ships with, something approximating a decent gun, then they can just, roll on with that and pull the 15-inch guns off of the ships that are being decommissioned, quickly recondition them, stick them on new hulls, and off they go. Which is kind of actually what the Royal Navy was planning on doing in extremis anyway. Right. So, then we have Burnt Potato asking, so say you're a naval director for a neutral Baltic nation. For political reasons, to demonstrate your fleet is only defensive and not a raiding one. Fleet ranges and tonnages are capped at 2,500 tons. You have an arms and armour industry that can produce any calibre up to 6-inch, license for Thornycroft boilers and engines, options to license any additional fire control, torpedoes, armour plate, etc. Your nation has developed its own rudimentary radar system. It's 1936 and your main concerns are Russia, Germany and Britain. What do you design and how many do you need to make everyone think twice? You also have options for fixed fortifications and mines. Minefields I'm definitely going for. If I can only produce up to 6-inch caliber guns, then fixed fortifications are probably a bit pointless, because anything small enough to be threatened by a 6-inch gun battery I can probably threaten with my ships, and anything that is too big that a 6-inch gun battery isn't going to worry it at all, well, then that was a pointless waste of money, wasn't it? So, and with a 2,500 ton cap, I can't even build anything resembling a respectable light cruiser. I'm not going to make the German mistake of trying to fit a 6-inch gun on a destroyer. So what I will probably end up doing is try and develop something along the lines of a slightly longer barrel 5-inch dual-purpose gun, because I can build destroyers up to 2,500 ton displacement. So at that point, obviously exploiting a little bit of future knowledge at this point, but I would be tempted to build something resembling a mashup between a Gearing and an L-class destroyer. So 3 twin mounts, each with a long barrel 5-inch weapon. Oh, well, 2 long barrel 5-inch weapons, so a total of 6 guns. A couple of quad torpedo launchers, lots of AA. Make it big, make it fast. At which point I have nice super destroyers, effectively. And since it's a small nation, building a few elite ships is much better than trying to compete with other nations with more standard displacements for destroyer-class vessels. And I'd say maybe at least a flotilla, so a dozen. I mean, that's not going to stop someone like the UK if they decide to come after me in the Baltic, but a dozen fast, very well armed, very heavily protected for their type destroyers. It's enough to worry the Germans, especially if I've got radar and decent AA fire control with dual purpose guns. They can kind of look after themselves to a degree. And for the Russians in the Baltic, well, they don't have enough large modern destroyers to tangle with me, and if they send cruisers in, I can torpedo them, and if they send in their old battleships, I can torpedo them as well. So that would be my rough and ready answer to that question. So I'm just trying to copy the super chat questions over, but the ring light I'm using so that you can actually see me instead of living in the darkness is literally incorporating, it's like covering over the last couple of sentences. Oh dear. Right. Togfather asks, you've mentioned in the past there was a proposal to give the QEs small tube boilers, which would give them a speed of 28 knots or so. I've seen elsewhere that there was a debate at the time over whether the QEs should be considered battleships or battle cruisers, as they were faster than the rest of the battle line and had the normal number of guns for a battle cruiser, 8 rather than the 10 of the normal dreadnought battleships. And BT had lobbied hard for them to be assigned to the battle cruiser fleet. If they'd had the small tube boilers, would that have strengthened the argument for calling them battle cruisers enough for BT to get them permanently rather than as a cover for a squadron doing gunnery training? And if so, would they have suffered from the same unfortunate gunnery performance that afflicted the battlecruisers at Jutland? Also, would they have simply been added to the existing battlecruiser fleet, or would their addition have allowed the older, slower and more vulnerable Invincibles and Indefatigables to be withdrawn to secondary duties or serve as a heavy screen unit for the Grand Fleet itself, where they could more easily fall back behind the battle line if anything nastier than an armoured cruiser appeared? Whew, right, oh, that's a question. Okay, so, to be honest, given their armour and given their firepower, it would take an awful lot for Jellicoe to surrender them from the Grand Fleet, even with a 28 knot speed. The most likely outcome is Jellicoe is just going to put his foot down and say, no, they're staying with me. Sure, you can have them in the same kind of circumstances that BT historically had them to cover for 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, but I don't think Jellicoe would let those ships out of his sight for very, very long. If, however, we go with a situation that this is in fact the case, and copy another one. Yeah, so if we go with this, with the idea that somehow BT manages to swing it those so that they are assigned to the battlecruiser fleet, then yeah, I can actually see the Invincibles and Indefatigables being detached, because the massive amount of numerical superiority it gives the battlecruiser fleet would be offset by the fact as per the Chase of Goeben, they already know the Invincibles and Indefatigables can't quite keep up with the German battlecruisers, and that would have been exhibited at Doggerbank as well. So, in order to allow what is still a massively superior battlecruiser fleet with 4 Splendid Cats and 5 QEs to operate at higher speed, then yeah, the older battlecruisers probably would be turned into the equivalent of 1st Cruiser Squadron, and reassigned to the Grand Fleet, which would be interesting. I mean, it's if they end up under Admiral Arbuthnot basically subbing in for Warrior, Defence and Black Prince, then, well, what happened to Defence and Warrior is probably still going to happen to them. They're not any better protected. But on the other hand, yeah, they might do better just by being so much larger. In fact, Jellicoe will probably try and keep them under closer control. He won't put them in the battle line, but deployment might be very different. As far as to whether they'd be subject to the same gunnery performance as the battlecruisers at Jutland, it greatly depends on exactly when they're detached, because one thing, even in the scenario where they end up in the battlecruiser fleet, Jellicoe isn't going to allow them to be drip-fed in one at a time. It'll be a whole squadrons or whole 2 squadrons swap, which means probably by the time it all happens, that you've got to a point where all the QEs have been completed. It's not that much further on, further back, and which way am I going? Yeah, it's not that much further time from when the QEs are completed to when they historically were assigned anyway. So that they may have a slight degradation in their gunnery training, but with any luck, the actual official swap over may very well be when 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron needs gunnery practice, and then the transfer is made permanent rather than temporary, at which point, you're going to get roughly the same gunnery performance that you do in real life. So just copying over a couple more super chat questions. People seem very eager for that today. Right. Da-da. So just copying a few bits, pieces. Right, there we go. Okay. Questions copied over. Blacksmith Panzer. Okay, that's right. Okay, short version. If you could go back and both choose where Warspite would be permanently moored and design either a museum to be located in the same property as the ship or just generally develop the area around her, using both what you know now and given what was around at the time, where would you have the ship moored and how would the general museum area around her look? How would you design the museum area so it could be upgraded over time? Okay, so this is the scenario is basically 1946, and I've got a blank checkbook to preserve Warspite as a museum. So my temptation would be one of two things. My initial steer would maybe be towards sticking her in Portsmouth. So HMS Warriors at the end of a pier or jetty at the sort of southwest of the fleet base, and obviously in the section that's now the National Museum of the Royal Navy. I would be tempted to stick her there because, well, you know, the thing has two sides. You can put Warspite on one side and then obviously 30, 40 years later Warrior can turn up on the other, which would be a very nice little bracket. And Warrior might have... I mean, unlike some museums where you have multiple ships from the same period, which does make it very difficult to justify, to generate the appropriate income, and Ryan Saminsky said a fair bit about that. The reason I think Portsmouth has gotten away with it so far, despite having, what, 1, 2, 3, 4 museum ships at any given time, is that it's spread out over so much history. There's nothing really similar about Mary Rose to Victory to Warrior to M33, and so it's enough of a unique offering each time, and Warrior would obviously be a unique offering again, a lot more advanced than Warspite would be a lot more advanced than Warrior. So that would be my initial thought, incorporate her into the Portsmouth Museum. In theory, you could try and pop her into the London Pool, which is where Belfast is now, although that would have interesting knock-on effects for Belfast. So what happens when she's preserved, or would she be preserved at all? Because Belfast was preserved in part because they wanted to have something fairly substantial left over from World War II. If Warspite already has been, there may not be quite the same drive. But if there is, then perhaps Belfast ends up adjacent to Warrior in Portsmouth and Warspite ends up in the City of London. Almost anywhere else, while there are a number of places, especially in the old shipbuilding areas of Scotland and Northern England, which might be worthy candidates on paper, the main problem with sticking her in any of those places is going to be revenue. You need to have a location to draw people in, and a ship of that size with the running costs that entails might struggle in those areas. So I think we are probably going to be looking at either London or Portsmouth. Personally, just because it would be much easier for me and actually probably better for the ship, I think maybe sticking her in London, in the place that Warspite currently occupies, sorry, that Belfast currently occupies, would have been the best idea. Knight 6831 saying Liverpool. No. Remember what happened to U534? If Warspite was left in Liverpool, then around about 2010 she'd be cut up into about 7 pieces and stuck on concrete. Charles fit. Okay, that's a question that's going to need me to delve into, so I'm going to have to come back to that one. Capitano Lorenzo says the year is 1804. Drack's been transported back in time and has the authority to add to the corps of the Royal Navy by, say, an additional 6 to 8 vessels. You can build any ship from any country of the period to supplement the Royal Navy and enforce the Pax Britannica. What vessels and types do you build? Okay, so if it's 1804 and I can add any 6 to 8 ships of any type from any country to supplement the Royal Navy, I'm probably adding half a dozen Océan class ships of the line, because that immediately, well, it doubles the Royal Navy's stock of first rates, and they have all new first rates, all at somewhere between 118 and 124 guns, depending on exactly how I model them. So that's going to give the Royal Navy's core force a huge amount of punch, and obviously you've got Victory, Royal Sovereign, and a few others around, but it also means that potentially in the longer term the Royal Navy can retire some of its older first rates, maybe some of its seconds, if they don't want to keep them all around. If they do keep them all around, then obviously they have much additional firepower. And also, as their history shows, the Océans were strong enough and large enough that they actually lasted long enough for a few of them to be converted to steam battleships. That gives the Royal Navy sailing fleet an additional bit of longevity. Martin Skeet saying Warspite should go to Chatham. I would broadly agree with you, except for the only problem with that is that if Warspite was around now, then being in Chatham would be really good. But Chatham, remember, was an active naval base up until about 30 years ago. So there wouldn't be anywhere for her to go in 1946 in Chatham that would allow a significant number of visitors to come and see her. Unless they hived off a bit of Chatham Dockyard, the way they've kind of hived off a bit of the Royal Navy base at Portsmouth and turned it into a museum area. But given the extent of the Chatham Dockyards at the time, again, it would be difficult to maintain her there. Sorry, the pollen has really gotten to me recently. I don't know what it is about pollen in Maryland, but it's really powerful. I'm mostly over it, but not quite. Salty Viking 10,022. If the German Navy had gotten, let's say, a total 4 total Bismarcks, as well as 2 H-39s commissioned, along with 5 additional Hippers for a total of 8, would that force, backed up by the Scharnhorst and U-boats, have an actual shot at starving out the UK by forcing convoys to travel with less escort because more fleet units have to stay close to home? It depends almost entirely on how they've got them. If they've been magically hand-waved into existence, then that would be a major problem for the Royal Navy. The Hippers, not so much. The Royal Navy's got more than enough cruisers to deal with a few additional Hippers. But if you've got 6 full-scale fast capital ships plus the Scharnhorsts, so 8 fast battleships total, that is going to require basically the entirety of the home fleet to sit around to watch them, and the Royal Navy doesn't have enough fast battleships to go up against that battle line straight up, because you're talking about 8 fast capital ships. The Royal Navy, in the first couple of years of the war, has Hood, Renown, Repulse, and King George V. By the time you're getting Prince of Wales just around the time of the historical Operation Rhinoboom, Rodney and Nelson, Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and Warspite can probably all hold the line and account decently well for themselves, especially Nelson and Rodney, but they're all too slow if the German fleet decides to just motor. Which would be a major problem. Of course, if we're talking about more realistic ways of developing, i.e. the Germans maybe instead of doing Graf Zeppelin, they lay down another Bismarck, stick another Bismarck in there somewhere else, and then of course they start on the H-39s, and they're gradually filtering in a more sane and reasonable manner. Well, if the Royal Navy knows that those ships are under construction, then they're either going to build more KGVs, continue with the Lions and or more Vanguards, at which point we're kind of just in a more heavily armed standoff variant of what we had historically, because yes, the Germans have more ships, but given when Tirpitz came into commission, the second two Bismarcks are probably not commissioning until late 42, early 43. The H-39 is probably late 43, early 44. And by that point, the Royal Navy has more than enough other capital ships to face off against them. And also by that point, the Americans are involved, so there'll be North Carolinas and or South Dakotas standing in as well. Avoid Shisnos asks, what do you, and if available, Ryan Szymanski, believe would happen if USS New Jersey in her 1989 format found herself in her current 2022 berth, i.e. in Camden, on December the 8th, 1941? Would she immediately be sent out to escort the carriers, or would they hold her back in order to go over her tech and armament with a fine-tooth comb, and how might it affect the war? Well, I mean, one ship, no matter how capable, is not going to make or break the entire war. But I think she would be held back to examine her tech. They'd want to know, because she'd have harpoons and tomahawks and CIWS aboard, apart from all her advanced radar. The advanced radar probably is less helpful than you'd think, because it would be great on New Jersey, but there is absolutely no way 1941 USA is replicating 1980s radar technology. Some of the older radars that are still on her from the latter part of the World War II might actually be quite useful to them. But also, hilariously enough, they're probably in December 8th of 41 probably going to view her as significantly underarmed anti-aircraft-wise, because remember, she's lost 4 of her 5-inch 38 twins in order to have the missile refit. All of her 20mm and 40mm are pretty much gone. Yes, she has the CIWS, but one, as far as the US Navy is concerned, that's only 4 guns, no matter how capable. And 2, I doubt 20mm Oerlikon and Phalanx Gatling 20mm ammunition are compatible. So you've got as long as you have an ammunition belt on terms of light AA defense. Now, okay, yeah, some of the radar systems, as long as they work, will probably make the 5-inch 38s even more lethal. But the first thing they're going to do, apart from analysing all her technology, is probably look around desperately for as many light and medium anti-aircraft guns as they can stick back on her, which, fortunately most of the original mounting points are still there, so they can up AA gun her while they're analysing her. And then, well, then you obviously make use of her onboard new technology, specifically the harpoons and the tomahawks, as soon as possible. The question at that point being, does she have nuclear tomahawks aboard or not? If so, that's an entirely different matter. But if not, let's assume she has either regular land attack or anti-shipping tomahawks plus harpoons. She may well at that point then be sent out to hunt down Japanese major surface assets. The Japanese battleships don't really come out to play, but you might see this kind of hybridized Iowa being sent in to, ripple off a salvo at the Japanese carriers, maybe even as early as Coral Sea, just to see what will happen. Oh yeah, that would be an amusing one. Okay, the next question is, the forces that attacked Mers El Kabir and Taranto are switched. How do things play out? So we're assuming that the attack forces themselves are switched out, but they presumably have the same orders and intentions. Well, Mers El Kabir is going to be a lot more destructive. Yes, there's only a couple of dozen swordfish, but they are fully trained and spec'd up for shallow water torpedo operations, and there's not going to be even the AA opposition that there was above Taranto. So stationary ships, minimal opposition, full deck strike package of torpedo bombers. That's probably going to end very badly for the French fleet. I don't think Dunkirk and Strasbourg... Well, Strasbourg's not getting away that day for sure, and Dunkirk's not getting away generally. The modern French ships will probably be sunk, as well probably will be a number of others. Taranto, on the other hand, is left in a bit of a problem, because what you've basically transported there is Ark Royal with, an air group that's not ready to launch a night torpedo strike, and a bunch of surface warships to a point several hundred miles away from Taranto, at which point in the middle of the night. So at that point, Taranto's as an attack probably just flat out doesn't happen, because they're just going to turn around and head for wherever home vaguely might be, because they don't have any ability to... I mean, Ark Royal theoretically has the capability of launching an air attack, but they're not... Her aircrew aren't ready, trained or briefed for it, so they aren't going to go for that. So yeah, basically, well, as far as the Royal Navy is concerned, at least, Mers El Kabir is much, much easier, but Taranto is much worse. De Vilde, thank you very much. Christopher Ryan, how much changes if the London Treaty not only restricts destroyer tonnage and armament, but does not impose a total tonnage limit? You can have as many destroyers as you like, as long as they're within certain armament and tonnage specs. Do you see hordes of tribals and French super destroyers? Well, if it restrains the destroyer's individual tonnage, the tribals and the super destroyers will fall victim to that anyway. But if there's no limit on destroyer numbers, i.e. there's no total tonnage limit, then yeah, I can see a lot of nations trying to push for the biggest, meanest destroyers they can. I mean, some, like the French, already were anyway, but yeah, I can see more powers, especially the US and the UK, and to be honest, even the Japanese, pushing for the biggest super destroyers they can possibly get their hands on, because without a tonnage limit, especially with the British with things like Design V, they may see this as a way of getting very small light cruisers in by the back door, and then trying to basically create a fleet of super destroyers dash very small cruisers in order to free up their fleet cruiser tonnage, which obviously is limited. Meatwad asks, how effective would Force Z have been in the defence of the Malay Barrier and Singapore had it survived? It's very difficult to judge, because in theory, because the forces arranged against them would mostly have been cruisers and less. In practice, it's a lot more difficult to work out, because of course, if Prince of Wales and Repulse are still around, that's going to influence how the Japanese are going to deploy their own forces. They had the Congos in the area, they could bring carriers into the area. They may well go with follow-up carrier airstrikes, plus trying to send it, maybe even risking the Congos in a surface action. And certainly the Congos would be more present around the time of ABDA command than they were historically. So it would be difficult to judge a realistic scenario. You could have everything from, Force Z survives its historic deployment, gets back to Singapore, and then the next voyage out that they do, they get sunk by, the Guido Butai. Or it could be that they hang around Singapore, and then when the Japanese invasion shows up, they do long-range HE shelling across the island, and blow up a bunch of attacking Japanese troops, which may allow Singapore to hold out longer, and then they may end up, depending on whether that turns the attack back or not, it might save Singapore for a while. It might not. If Singapore falls, then they probably end up either falling back to Ceylon or Australia. They certainly would have caused the Japanese a lot more problems, and they would have forced them to commit a lot more resources. But to be honest, even two full-speed capital ships are not going to stop the Japanese, all told. They're either basically going to cost them a lot of time or cost them a lot of blood, or possibly both in the best case scenario, but they are either going to end up sunk or withdrawn eventually. Chazix asks, in 1890, East India Company versus the rest of the world's navies without the British Royal Navy. Well, the East India Company is going to get rolled quite quickly, unfortunately. Well, fortunately, depending on which side you're on. The East India Company is big and powerful and has an awful lot of money, and they have an awful lot of ships, and a lot of those ships are very heavily armed by merchant standards, but they don't have anything resembling even a third-rate ship of the line. So any fleet with a decent number of third rates, i.e. Spain, France, etc., they're going to mop the East India Company ships up pretty darn quickly. Anything that survives is going to be surviving mainly on the basis of just sheer number of ships out there. I mean, even the larger frigates, so certainly the US super frigates, for example, would be capable of manhandling 95% of all the armed Indiamen out there. It's not quite Pirates of the Caribbean 3, where they have, full-on Royal Navy warships. Most armed East Indiamen that were considered relatively heavily armed had armament roughly on the scale of a regular-sized frigate. A small handful had armament either armament or the capability to be armed to the specification of a fourth rate, but nothing more than that. Some random non asks, do you think there is a place for battleships in the modern era, and if not, why not? If so, what design or designs would you go with? Do you think 14-inch shells could be used in modern ship designs, and what would the inclusion of such large weapons require of modern ships? In the current modern naval era, battleships, in as much as heavily armoured warships armed primarily with heavy guns, they exist in a bit of a quantum state. Their heavy armour means that to a certain degree they are actually far more capable of resisting the impact of modern anti-shipping weapons than the vast majority of modern ships are. The problem is that A, that's not universally applicable to all modern anti-ship missiles, and B, the majority of anti-ship missiles that they might be able to resist, things like Exocets, harpoons, maybe the odd penguin that's lying around, or a Styx, or a silkworm, those things mainly aren't particularly good at punching through the armoured citadel of a battleship, because they weren't designed in an era where they had to think about punching through the armoured citadel of a battleship. When you look at the first and some of the second-gen anti-ship missiles that were designed with that in mind, they were a lot nastier. So bringing a ship in would give you great survivability for a few minutes until someone rolls out the designs of some of the older school warheads, sticks them on new bodies, and all of a sudden you're just as vulnerable, except now you're carrying a bunch of tonnage in armour, which a modern ship of a similar displacement obviously could devote to more weapons, which might keep it alive for a little bit longer. Primark 359, is the modern rapid-fire automated deck gun an outgrowth of previous destroyer single-mount guns, or are they so fundamentally different that they have few roots in the period the channel covers? Or were the late-war radar-directed medium anti-aircraft guns their direct ancestor? Also, did the 57mm chambering have roots in World War II, or just the 3-inch and 5-inch? As far as I'm aware, 3-inch, 5-inch, 4.5-inch, 4-inch, etc. are the wartime calibers that have kind of been inherited down the years. 57mm is not really a very common caliber at all in World War II. But in terms of modern deck guns, they are more outgrowths of destroyer single mounts or very late war or immediate post-war larger ship secondaries, because well, the difference between that and an AA gun was fundamentally almost none by that point. Radar-directed, fast-firing, semi or fully automated AA guns that also have an anti-surface role, or anti-surface guns that have an AA role, were pretty much par for the course in the late 1940s, and that's just been continued. I mean, the 4.5 inch, which has been the deck gun of almost, not quite, given a few of the more very more recent ships, but almost every other Royal Navy warship from World War II till now, is basically the same gun, just with different electronics and motors and stuff attached to it. It's been modified a little bit down the line, but you can, if you start off with something like the 4.5 inch on the Darings or the latter C-class destroyers and the battle class in World War II, and you look at the 4.5 inch guns that are on even, you know, Type 23s today, there's a direct and very short ancestral tree. We're doing quite well, actually. We're almost done with Patreon questions. Then I can move on to the super chats, and then I can move on to talking more generally. Brian Roper asks, I understand you are very much adverse from eating anything green. Yes, this is true. Does this apply to green things that are deep fried? Yes. If it was green at some point in its history, I don't want to eat it. Basically, this is my two rules. I don't eat vegetables, and I don't eat things that didn't have a spine. So, vertebrate-based meat, bread, potatoes get a promotion to honorary meat, because then I can have chips and fries and things like that. But yeah, otherwise, vegetation and invertebrate life is not on my menu. Just put me in front of a southern barbecue, and I will be perfectly happy. Ash the Lego guy asks, I live in coastal Southern California, and if you know what to look for, you can see remnants of the shore defences and support for them surviving in various forms. If Japan had the ability to project an invasion force to the American west coast in late spring 42 at the same strength they did in the Philippines, how effective would the coastal defences have been? It's a very binary thing. If somehow magically this magical long-range Japanese invasion force had shown up off the US west coast, if the Japanese troops had been dumb enough to throw themselves straight at the more modern US coastal defences, they would have been very effective. I mean, just look at Wake Island. It turns out a single 5-inch gun can be very effective when it comes to dissuading the Japanese from invading. Fort Drum's ability to hold out as well, for as long as it did. But the flip side to that is that there's an awful lot of US coastline and not a tremendous number of coastal fortifications. So if the Japanese have anything like a functioning brain cell in the event of this magical invasion, they'll just land 20, 30, 40 miles up the coast where there isn't a coastal defense battery and then march overland towards it. But that obviously, and then that becomes more of a land battle rather than a sea battle. Although maybe some of the coastal defences could engage targets on land as well. I don't even know how to pronounce that, but the first part of it is Commander Hamfisted, and he asks, let's say it's autumn of 43 and a US battleship of your choice is hit and penetrated by 5 16-inch shells during a surface engagement. Where would these shells have to land to have the most impact on events tactically, operationally, and strategically? Well, tactically, obviously, the answer is the magazines. Although if you're having 5, 1 on each magazine and 2 in the engineering spaces will probably do in pretty much any battleship. 5 16-inch shells, I mean, that suggests you're fighting the Japanese, and more specifically suggests you're fighting Nagato. So your tactical placement. Operationally, well, Autumn 43. What's happening in Autumn 43? It would have to basically be a Japanese counter push during the early to mid part of the island hopping campaign involving Nagato. For whatever reason, the US has taken, well, obviously was taking umbrage at this, but has decided to send out a battle line to face the off. I mean, a single battleship being hit and basically destroyed by that kind of salvo. Operationally and strategically, maybe target a South Dakota or an Iowa. It's going to be an annoyance, but to be honest, in Autumn 43, you could atomize a single US fast battleship from the face of the planet in the Pacific, and it's not going to make a tremendous amount of difference overall, unless you happen to catch a flagship with a particularly important admiral like Halsey or Lee on board, which would be a fairly major strategic impact. But at that point, that's less about taking out the battleship and more about taking out a person. Let's copy over those. Capitano Lorenzo asks, 12th of December 1941, Admiral Phillips' highly publicised Task Force Z has survived the initial vicious Japanese aerial onslaught, albeit with substantial torpedo and bomb damage and casualties, and both vessels are now in Singapore Harbour. Therein is my question. The Singapore Island will ultimately be assaulted within the same time frame as it was historically, but no one has that knowledge yet. Could the presence of both vessels in the harbour actually turn the tide of battle? If Singapore falls regardless, we assume both vessels are still seaworthy though damaged, what are their credible options within the Royal Navy, and what are their destination options? Pearl Harbor is still a mess. San Francisco, Seattle and San Diego do have full kit repair facilities, but are far away, perhaps Ceylon or Australia. What to do? The presence of both vessels in harbour will probably just provoke more air raids. Depending on what those do, they may damage them or not, and pretty much similar to one of the previous questions, they could provide quite extensive counter-battery fire with actual HE shells against the incoming Japanese invasion. They'll certainly stall them. It might break their attack, it might not. It's difficult to predict for certain. I mean, a lot of it depends on what areas of the Japanese advance they can target. But assuming that eventually Singapore does fall at some point, but as you say, the ships are seaworthy, if they're still in need of several months of refit and repair, then I suspect that they're not necessarily going to want to send them west. Initially, the Royal Navy will probably want to send them to Ceylon, but fully refitting and repairing 2 fast capital ships is probably a little bit beyond Ceylon's immediate capabilities. And then otherwise having to face sending them across the Indian Ocean, not through the Mediterranean, definitely, but then probably round South Africa and then up through the Atlantic, past all the U-boats and the Luftwaffe. I don't think they'd go for that. They would probably I think they'd be heading for Ceylon initially for a quick bit of additional patch up if they need it, otherwise straight to Australia, or then from Ceylon to Australia. And then they'd probably get patched up further in Australia as best they can, and then sent over to the US West Coast for fixing, probably as part of a deal wherein they provide fast capital ship strength once fixed for the US Navy in kind of an early version of USS Robin. Yeah, that would be the most likely outcome in my book. They'd then basically ride escort on US fleet carriers for a while until the North Carolinas and later South Dakotas can come in and relieve them, which will probably be a nice bit of quid pro quo for everyone involved, because obviously the North Carolinas are completing on the East Coast, so they would probably initially be doing their Arctic convoy work that they historically did, and now the US feels that the scales are a little bit more balanced because you've got 2 corresponding fast capital ships running around the Pacific, which is probably also going to give the Royal Navy a lot more experience with the 40mm, 20mm combination a lot sooner. And Repulse might very well get 5-inch 38s. Sorry, just refilling the iron brew. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, concerning HMCS Haida, did she ever receive a blessing from the Haida First Nation? Genuinely, I don't know. For the World War II period, I do doubt that somewhat, but I could be wrong. But then again, I am heading off to see Haida in the beginning of June, so I'm going to be making 2 transatlantic flights in as many months, which is going to be interesting. So I shall take your question unto the curators of HMSCS Haida and ask them in June. So that'll be an interesting one. Towboat asks, even more of a stretch, if Yamamoto gives up on the Midway campaign, commits all of his forces to finish south to finish New Guinea and cut off Australia, what effect does that have on the course of the war? Well, it means that the first counter-invasion, instead of being on Guadalcanal, well, there may still be landing on Guadalcanal, but there's going to be major Allied forces being rushed into New Guinea to stem that tide. So basically, the Guadalcanal, what historically is the Guadalcanal campaign, is probably going to be stretched into a much more combined Guadalcanal-New Guinea campaign, which is going to lead to some interesting changes in the division of force responsibility amongst MacArthur and Nimitz, because the Allies are fairly well aware of the fact they can't let Australia be cut off. That was the whole impetus behind the Guadalcanal campaign, and that Henderson Field might be able to actually cut off communications and supply lines trans-Pacific for the Australians. The interesting part there is, of course, that you're going to end up with I'm just copying across a couple of questions. You're going to end up with things or something approximating the Battle of Eastern Solomons or the Battle of Santa Cruz, except they're going to be, i.e. where both sides know that the enemy is in the general area, just not exactly where, with both sides having significantly more carriers to hand. Now that is going to be a vicious fight, because of course one of the big strengths of Midway from the US perspective, even though they're outnumbered, was that they had surprise. In this element, the Japanese are going to know full well that the Americans are coming. So it's probably going to be a very, very nasty knockdown, drag-out fight. There's not going to be much left at the end of it afloat, pretty much similar to how the Guadalcanal campaign itself went, with the sole caveat that being a little bit closer to the Allied home bases, if you like, with Australia, the Allies will probably have a little bit more of a leg up than they did in just the historical Guadalcanal campaign, because the Japanese correspondingly will be operating slightly further away from their home bases, or, well, their forward operating bases like Rabaul. Okay. Excuse me a second. There we go. Hopefully that'll stave off the pollen a little bit. Patrick Donnelly asks, Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff get cold feet after the Battle of Coral Sea. They postpone the invasion of Midway until Shikaku is repaired and Shi and Zuikaku have their air groups replenished. US Navy intel picks up on this. What options does Admiral Nimitz have available to him? Not a tremendous amount, because the Japanese have the numerical advantage carrier-wise at this point. Now, what it probably does allow is it allows Yorktown to be more fully repaired. So her engine plant, her power plant probably gets back up to full power. And of course, Saratoga will be coming out of dock. Well, she's already on her way, technically speaking, by the time of historical Midway. But yeah, so they get Saratoga, Yorktown up to full spec. So that means the US now has 4 carriers ready to go. Basically, the 3 Yorktowns plus Saratoga. If they skedaddle, they might get Wasp in as well, which would give them 5, albeit one of questionable survivability. The Japanese obviously have the historical Midway force plus Shikaku and Zuikaku. So the Japanese still technically have a slight numbers advantage in terms of flight decks. They might also slightly close the aircraft and pilots advantage, because obviously they've got a few more months. Well, they're replenishing Zuikaku's air group as well to build up their pilot numbers somewhat. So for the US, it will be a case of consolidate, repair, consolidate, repair, consolidate, repair. And then when this new Battle of Midway sort of shakes down, basically try and repeat what the historical one was going to be, but on a larger scale, because obviously, well, both sides have effectively added 2 flight decks to their lineup. Hopefully at some point also train Hornet's air group in navigation, but that's by the by. So yeah, that it would just be a grand battle royale, but probably actually maybe even more decisively in America's favour. It'd be an interesting one to try and work out. And then the last one that I've got here, apart from 2, which I need to do a lot more research into and I'll come back to maybe next week, are... That needs to go up there. So Graham William Kidd asks... Oh no, sorry, there's 2. There's 2 questions. So Graham William Kidd asks... The Australian and New Zealand governments refused to allow the destruction of HMS Australia and HMS New Zealand. Both vessels existing at full modernisation in the late 1930s. What Royal Navy ships get sacrificed under the treaties instead? And how do Australia and New Zealand get used in World War II? Well, I mean, technically the New Zealand government doesn't have any choice in the matter with HMS New Zealand, because it's... actually a Royal Navy ship. They did give it, as opposed to Australia, which technically still owns HMS Australia. I mean, if they don't want them to be destroyed, the best option is to sit at the Washington Treaty table as their own powers, which then gives the Royal Navy the opportunity to do everything it needs to do historically anyway. But assuming that they all go in as one group, but they insist on these things being kept, it's going to depend on how they're classified. If they are classified under the as written Washington Treaty rules as capital ships, things are going to get very awkward, because that's a treaty battleship and changes worth of tonnage that the Royal Navy's really not going to be happy about being short of. Especially considering they don't really have any ships at that point that they would really want to get rid of in order to compensate for it. I mean, they can get rid of the King George V's. Well, they're getting rid of the King George V quite quickly anyway. They could get rid of the Iron Dukes and Tiger a little bit earlier, but then come 1930... I can't see the Royal Navy being very happy about dropping an R-class or an R-class in a bit to allow these things to stick around. I think what would probably happen instead is that they'd be either they would change the definition of cruiser to include Australia and New Zealand, or they get specially grandfathered in as cruisers, to stop people exploiting it, the loophole. So it'd be a case of, right, these two are historically counted as cruisers, and they count towards the Royal Navy's cruiser displacement, obviously heavy, by the London Treaty, heavy cruiser displacement, but no one else can get away with it. At which point, that's basically 4 county class worth of tonnage. Excuse me. Anyway, yeah, that's 4 county class worth of tonnage. I suspect the Royal Navy might at that point actually still build the full spec of county class. They might just, because under Washington a cruiser is a cruiser is a cruiser, so they might sacrifice a bunch of their older, smaller cruisers, maybe some of the early C class, to keep them around. Fully modernised in the late 1930s. Australia will be the flagship of the Royal Australian Navy, so she's probably going to stay in the Pacific, maybe show up in the Mediterranean as a cruiser hunter. HMS New Zealand will be obviously with the Royal Navy itself, and will probably be its sort of lead cruiser flagship, cruiser hunter specialist. Right, and then Edward Olson asks, and this is the last Patreon question, then we move into the super chats. I was reading about the South Dakota class and saw them referred to as cramped since they need to be armoured against their own 16-inch guns, but they're limited to being basically treaty displacement. From my trip to USS Alabama, I don't recall it feeling that cramped, but how do they compare to the Iowas? Does their extra 10,000 tons allow for any significant improvement to the size of crew quarters and work areas that in and of itself improve the ships? Had the South Dakotas been built with the extra tonnage, how would they compare? Well, considering the Iowas are basically South Dakota plus 10,000 tons in exchange for more speed, well, look at the Iowas, basically. But, yeah, a South Dakota class battleship is still a 35,000 ton battleship. It's not going to feel that cramped compared to a destroyer or a cruiser, at least to most people who are visiting. Where you notice the differences is, say, for example, if you're on Alabama or Massachusetts bow or stern, and then you're on the stern of Iowa or New Jersey or Wisconsin, and you notice how much more additional space there is on the deck, because obviously the Iowas have significantly longer bows and slightly longer sterns. That in turn leads to more volume below, so more volume for storage space, more volume for crew space, more volume for all sorts of wonderful things. And of course the Iowa superstructure is also slightly longer because they have 2 funnels as opposed to 1 on the South Dakotas. So yeah, in terms of cramped, there were a few restrictions. It's just because of volume, especially once you had to start to take into account all the additional anti-aircraft gun crews. So the South Dakotas filled up a lot faster than the Iowas did. But cramped is also, in terms of the South Dakotas, a measure of where their components are relative to each other. So the South Dakotas were a lot more vulnerable to the blast of their own guns when their guns were in any way, shape or form beyond 90-degree broadsides, and even at 90-degree broadsides, as compared to the Iowas, because their guns were just that much closer to the rest of the ship. And, with things like pressure dropping off as a square of distance, even a matter of a few feet, well, not a few feet, a matter of a few tens of feet can make a huge difference in terms of the overall blast effects of the guns on 2 different classes of ship. So the 2 questions which I need to come back to at some point, probably in another live stream, probably in 2 weeks' time, is Charles Fitt's question on an expansion for Flying Circus, which apparently seems to be some kind of RPG, and Dr. Irrelevant's question about Battleship New Jersey's deployment after her reactivation in the 60s, which, given that it is a post-1950 question, I'm not entirely sure that it's appropriate for the channel, but I will consider. Right. Let's get through the Super Chat questions. So, starting from the top. Get rid of that. Class A Cornate asks, if the High Seas Fleet had sunk all the deployed Queen Elizabeths at Jutland, what do the British use for the Washington Naval Treaty Fleet? If they've lost all the QEs, then they're either going to be... I think they would either be building replacements during the war, or if they don't building just replacement QEs because they have the plans, they're very definitely not going to suspend work for very long on Hood and her sisters, because obviously Hood is basically, the Steelline spec of Hood is QE armament, QE protection, but battle cruiser speeds. So at the very least they're going to go full bore on the construction of Hood's three sisters, the full Admiral class. That tonnage wise probably actually covers the overall tonnage, even if it doesn't cover the numbers. So the British are probably going to come to the table with 4 Hoods. It'll be 4 Hoods and the R class plus Renown and Repulse, and still probably end up arguing, and maybe even successfully arguing, for Nelson and Rodney, probably on the basis that they will have a numerically inferior fleet, therefore they need to have at least a pair of 16-inch gun ships once you've accounted for tonnage. That's the most likely thing. It's too late to resurrect resistance. So yeah, I think the most likely thing is that they'll build at least 3 Hoods, possibly even more, and then have to play with that at Washington. Animal 16365 says, I hope the American hospitality was up to par on your visit here. Oh, very definitely. Pretty much everyone was incredibly friendly, incredibly welcoming, incredibly hospitable. I didn't worry pretty much during the trip that, if something was going to go wrong, I was pretty sure there would be about half a dozen people at least who would be willing to jump in and offer advice on how to fix it or just solve the problem themselves. Yeah, everyone who offered us hospitality was absolutely top notch. I have lots of thank you letters and so forth to be sending soon. As soon as I've dealt with all the stress of unpacking, etc. Deep Blue Dreams, most one-sided true naval engagement. I can't see much worse than when Iowa and New Jersey smashed Port Katori into many small pieces. Yeah, that's probably up there. The only caveat I would say to that in terms of being one-sided is at least Katori could see them coming, so they knew what was going on and could run away. I think Washington versus Kirishima and the Battle of Cape Matapan probably fall into even more one-sided engagements, because it's just as much smashing, even if the targets, in theory, if they'd known the opponent was there, could have fought back somewhat better. But the thing was, they didn't. Katori could at least see what was happening and evade. The Italian cruisers at Matapan and Kirishima had no idea what was going on until people started plugging battleship AP rounds into them. Christian Slot Hulk asks, how would World War II go differently in the Mediterranean had the invasion of Crete failed and Britain gets air and naval bases on Crete? Well, if the invasion of Crete fails, there's no evacuation. if there's no evacuation, then a reasonable number of Royal Navy ships still survive, like Gloucester, for example, and others that get damaged presumably either don't get damaged or get damaged somewhat less. A naval base on Crete is probably not tremendously useful except as a staging point for lighter vessels, because it will be in range of enemy air power quite easily. But air bases on Crete, well, they'll basically be fighting a slightly longer distance version of Malta, trying to keep Axis aircraft away from the naval base and other assets whilst gradually being whittled down. But by securing the northern flank of the Eastern Mediterranean, it will, well, best case scenario, it forces the Axis efforts back and results in overall fewer lost Allied ships because they're able to extend anti-sub efforts over a wider area, etc. Worst case scenario, the fact that they managed to hold on to Crete and its relative proximity to Greece might mean that Churchill might order everybody to go and have another go at trying to retake Greece or something equally silly. Yeah. It could go either way. Thomas 1918 asks, what was the blue light on German submarines for? As far as I'm aware, as far as I'm aware, that's basically a version of the red lights that were used on Allied submarines. Basically, a single continuous frequency of light to make sure that you don't lose your night vision and so forth when you're having to look through a periscope and so forth. It's just a different way of doing it. That's as far as I understand, and at least I think in Das Boot they use it to signify silent running as well, which may or may not be a thing in reality. But as far as I'm aware, that the general use of the blue light on a German subs is basically, well, they decided to use that instead of or in addition to a red light for eyesight purposes. Wow, turns out there were a lot of super chat questions. Galdia Ioni asks, officers are literally going mad. I know of Coronel and the 2nd Pacific Squadron's ill-fated voyage, but are there any more high-profile cases? Oh, officers going mad. It happened at a semi-infrequent rate in the Age of Sail, but in terms of 20th century, I actually can't recall offhand in terms of high-profile major cases. There are a reasonable number of, wartime stress and shock getting to people and people having to be relieved or just let go at the end of the voyage. I have read a fair number of accounts about those, or people just losing it in the middle of combat. But whilst that's, again, a not infrequent occurrence, the kind of thing on the level of a chief engineer losing it for a significant period of time, or the kind of somewhat disturbingly widespread mania that gripped parts of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, those I'm personally at the moment not aware of any other high profile cases in certainly World War I, World War II. James Mackenzie asks, as improbable as it is, what if Bismarck had been ready in time for the Norwegian campaign, without the British shipbuilding changing from historical? Well, they had Rodney around. Hood was off doing her own thing. I mean, what would Bismarck do in the Norwegian campaign? Probably sail around with Scharnhorst and Gneisenau as a covering distraction force. At which point, the British, well, they'll probably pair up their capital ships, assuming they realise that the Germans are out there in the first place. Renown's not going to fight Lofoten if Bismarck's involved as well. But yeah, I suspect their first response would be to get Rodney out there, probably drag Nelson up there as well, and make sure everybody's paired off. But again, it depends on, one, the British realising that the Bismarck is out there with the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and also on them actually running into anything. James Mackenzie asks, I remember reading the Battle of Crete was the single costliest in terms of most killed naval battle for the Royal Navy during World War II. Yeah, I was going to say not the most costliest naval battle for the Royal Navy period, but maybe during World War II. I'd have to look up the exact casualty figures. But anyway, why were the air attacks so effective? Basically, two things. One, the Navy was tied to fixed, to a certain degree, tied to fixed points, i.e. tied to the evacuation. So, unlike any other normal naval battle, they didn't have the freedom of action to evade. They had to be in certain locations at certain times, which the Germans knew, and if they were in the actual evacuation part of the operation, or covering closely that, they were also somewhat restricted in speed. So they're restricted in speed, restricted in location. They're at known points. That makes it a lot easier to organise an air attack against them. And even if they're on the more distant covering force, you're still in a position where you're going to be looking around and going, well, we know they're somewhere in the area, and we know they can't go tremendously far. And that couples with the other thing, which is just the sheer persistence of the attacks. This is something that perhaps is underappreciated about the Mediterranean campaign when compared to carrier battles. A carrier can launch its big strike, and then that's it. That carrier has to wait until the aircraft come back, and then it's quite an extensive process to recover all your damaged aircraft, and your regular aircraft as well, get them all down, refuel, rearm, replace if necessary. Your air group is going to be somewhat diminished, most likely, and then eventually maybe you can pull it off again. Whereas with air bases, land-based air bases in the Mediterranean, these aircraft could fly in, drop their bombs, go back, much more safe, predictable way of getting home, and it was much quicker to turn them around, refuel and rearm them on a big airbase than it is in the relatively cramped confines of a carrier. You can land them a lot more quickly, and then you can turn around and head off again the same day quite easily. And if you don't want to do that, well, you probably, again, with air bases with so many aircraft, you can just send off the next wave. And if aircraft come back damaged, well, swap them out for new aircraft you've got sitting around. There's just so much more utility to having multiple large land-based air bases. And so the Royal Navy is just subjected to attack after attack after attack after attack for days on end, to the point that some of the ships are, like Gloucester, are flat out run out of anti-aircraft ammunition, which is not something you tend to find happening in any of the carrier battles, because they just don't last long enough for that to happen. And once they've run out of ammunition, ships make somewhat easier targets. Animal 16365, had the Japanese Navy gotten the same tonnage as the Royal Navy and US Navy, what effect on their building design of their future, what effects would there be on their ships under construction and the designs of their future ships prior to World War II? Well, there'd be a lot more of them. If they, let me just check something. Okay, so the Tulsa class is still going to fall outside of the realm of the Washington Treaty restrictions. So they're going to have to dial those back in a bit. But if they're given the same tonnage, then, well, that actually leaves them in a very enviable position. Because if they suddenly have the same tonnage as the Royal Navy and the US Navy, that effectively gives them, obviously they can complete Nagato and Mutsu, but they can effectively then complete at least another 5 or 6 16-inch capital ships to fill out their tonnage. So they're going to end up with 7 or 8 16-inch armed ships, i.e. more 16-inch armed ships than the US and the UK have put together, which is not going to please the Royal Navy or the US Navy, but paradoxically is probably also the best outcome, because at least that means that going into the 1930s and World War II, the Japanese are on the same replacement schedule as everybody else, whereas if they build in some kind of thing that says, okay, we're giving you the tonnage, but we're only going to let you build up slowly, then obviously that means the Japanese will be perfectly legally building 35,000-ton battleships in, say, around about the time the Italians and the French would be legally allowed to do so, as well as when everyone starts building up. So they actually have lots of modern fast battleships going around, which would be not the best thing for the Allies in World War II. So it depends, I think, which way around the Allies let that happen. If they're thinking short term, it'll end up bad long term. If they actually think ahead and work out what it's going to mean, they might actually end up with just a bunch of extra Nagatos or slightly improved Nagatos floating around. Of course, if the Japanese are treated as an equal at the Washington Treaty, they might not be quite as salty about the Washington Treaty, and you might not have quite the same breakdown of relations that you get in the 1930s. You might still have that. Who knows? I mean, the US Navy is not going to be happy at all about having 2 potential rivals that are both the same tonnage as it. Clever Clothe, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much indeed. So yeah, that's the IJN with 15 theoretical capital ships. Sherman 117 asks, welcome back, thank you very much. Here's a crazy question. If the US somehow started to build a Tillman-class battleship but it's not ready by the Washington Treaty and the US decides to complete it as a carrier, how crazy is that going to be? So, I mean, it depends on the Tillman, which Tillman they build. I'm just going to check the various specs. So, you've got the maximum battleships. The main problem with any of the Tillmans, apart from Tillman 3, is that they're slow. So they're going to make even cargo won't look fast by comparison. So they'll be big. I mean, you've got 70 to 80,000 ton displacements, but 25 to 26 knots, yeah. Lots of flight deck space, lots of beam. I mean, by the time they've been given flight decks, there'll probably be about 1,000-foot flight deck. So kind of incomparable size, but the speed is going to be a bit of a pain. The best option would be if they build a Tillman 3, obviously using a little bit of future sight there, because that's a 30-knot design, again with a 1,000-foot flight deck. But I don't think they're going to be allowed to complete that, because even the Tillman 3 is well over 63,000 tons. There's no way you're getting that down into any kind of reasonable restriction of tonnage. Yeah, so it would be a crazy ship. And you kind of see some of my thoughts previously on an incomparable class carrier. It's pretty much roughly the same size and capability. But there's absolutely no way you're getting that through the Washington Treaty powers. Not unless everybody gets one super ship to convert. So, you know, unless, again, there's some kind of special clause, everyone gets one mega carrier. So the US gets a Tillman carrier, the British get an incomparable carrier. I don't know, the Japanese would have to magic something up out of nowhere. Jeff Barney asks, how would you rate the 15-inch refitted Gneisenau? I imagine with one less turret and a thinner turtleback, she's still a bit inferior to Tirpitz, but far more capable, and of taking an old R-class on her own, perhaps. Yeah, a 15-inch Scharnhorst class is more than capable of throwing down with an old R-class or even Malaya. And as I've said before, I think it would represent a better cost value, because, yes, in some ways fractionally worse armor, in some ways fractionally better than a Bismarck class. Yes, one less turret, but probably doesn't make a huge amount of difference because, you know, for their size and their displacement, you're actually getting a decent amount of firepower, i.e. a relatively speaking, efficient design engineering-wise in terms of firepower per ton as compared to, you know, the Bismarcks, which add an awful lot of weight and don't offer all that much more in terms of capability. So yeah, I would rate them pretty highly because, you know, I have a soft spot for Renown, and when you compare a 15-inch Scharnhorst Organizer with a Renown, their guns are more powerful, they've got similar speed, and they've got better protection. So what's not to like, especially on a ship that, I don't know, refitted Gneisenau might just about start reaching treaty battleship levels of displacement, but who knows. I'll be so glad when this legacy pollen attack from the States ends. Daniel Silverthorne, whatever became of the 1920s battlecruiser dash fast battleships rig shop design competition? As far as I'm aware, still stuck in judging hell. I should probably press to wrap that up at some point this summer. Yeah, that's a bit of a blast from the past. But yeah, I'll try and get that sorted over the summer. Sarah Lowe asks, how was there in Drac again? It was excellent. Did you get to eat proper tacos and barbecue? Tacos? No, actually, bizarrely. There were a couple of places that we actually had targeted, like In-N-Out Burger, proper tacos, which somehow we never got around to. I also wanted to see if they had the KFC Double Down at one of the KFCs, but somehow never got around to actually visiting a KFC. Although we got a chance to visit almost every other US fast food place, including the ones that you guys have and we don't. Any other food you really enjoyed? Yeah, well, the Southern barbecue, absolutely top notch. I'm on a hunt for cornbread now as well, because that was a surprisingly delicious thing to discover. What else was really? Oh yeah, I mean, as I said to a lot of guys who showed up on the various ships, you can get good steak in the UK, you can get good burgers in the UK, the same as you can get good steak and good burgers in the US. But something that the UK seems almost impossible. It seems almost impossible to get in the UK that the US really, really does well, and apparently seems to do consistently well, is chicken. You guys really know how to make your chicken. And in a way that's actually tasty and not, you know, well, here is a unidentifiable protein mass to which we have added some exterior taste. No, the chicken in the US actually tastes of something, at least at the places we were at. Also, I think the other thing, biscuits and gravy, not something I expected to like in a million years. But I tried it just because I was there and actually did find that was pretty good. But in a fight between biscuits and gravy and cornbread, difficult as it may be, if I could get one of them reliably in the UK, it would be cornbread, because I just balloon. Yeah, Chipagorgi, apparently there are one or two very odd niche places in the UK that sell cornbread, and there's a bunch more that sell cornbread mix to make at home, which might well be something I'm going to be doing. But it's not nowhere near as readily available as it is in the States. But at the same time, proper US barbecue, oh my goodness. That's where I'm just like, food. Silence now, inhaling. Oh dear. And Sarah Lowe also asks, did Athias really manhandle you into a picture a fan wanted before saying hello? Yeah, kind of. That was quite funny, actually, because that was on Yorktown. I was so locked into answering questions. I was basically in Drac Live Drydock mode, pretty much as we are in now. Some part of my brain clocked, there is a large man with an excellent beard here. And then my brain just cut off. I was like, that's cool. Anyway, moving on. And some part in the back of my brain was just going tick, tick. No, there's something more significant going on here. What's going on? What's going on? But because I was fielding live questions all the time, it kind of ran on the background process. And then Matthias was like, hello. And then I was, and yeah, it took me a few seconds for my brain to go, changing. Ah, right. That's why. Okay, sorry. Brain no function properly at the moment. It was a little embarrassing for me to say the least. It's just like, yes, I know exactly who this guy is, and somehow my brain just completely blanked on an actual ID until after he'd actually, basically poked me and said, "Oh, remember? Yeah, oh yes. Oh dear. Oh yeah, William Kirchmeier. That was the other really good food experience of, weirdly of all things, the little hot dog van sat on the back of USS Iowa. Did possibly the single best hot dog I've ever eaten. I mean, LA is a long way to fly for a hot dog. I might consider driving up from San Diego next year, though. Oh yeah, and of course there was the Philly cheesesteak in Philadelphia. Did definitely enjoy that. You're reminding me of all these good foods. Melanie 16040. Yeah, basically I took a massive dose of Virginia and Maryland tree pollen on the Thursday and Friday last week, and it took me like a week just to stop looking like a gas attack victim, and even now it's still clogging up a little bit. Chipper Corky saying, I've heard from several friends who moved from the UK that they find American food unpleasantly sweet. Well, I'm not going to be one of those. I've at one point when I drank coffee on a regular basis, I was described as drinking weaponized caramel, and my recipe for making tea or coffee is, you've made the tea and the coffee, this is good, now add sugar till it stops dissolving. Yeah, to say I have a sweet tooth, I mean, I once drank concentrate fruit juice without thinking it was just a slightly sweeter version of my normal mix. Sweetness, you'd have to really push the boat out on the sweetness to get me to start going, okay. Oh, and churros, I did eventually get, someone gave me some really nice churros in Boston of all places, and then I found even better, well, not better churros, because those churros were filled, those were really nice, but I did find some really nice cinnamon churros as I went further south as well. Anyway, that was an interesting one. Sapper Ninja, now I know that that's how it's pronounced, asks, just for fun, daring versus daring, Type 45 versus 1945. Projectile weapons only, 1v1 and 5v5. Projectile weapons only. The daring 1945 has the advantages. It has 6 times the guns, and through most of its career, radar-directed firepower that, okay, the Type 45 has technically a slightly longer range, but I think the 1945 Daring can probably outpace it and close the range. And their weapon ranges aren't too dissimilar last time I checked. So actually, yeah, in a gunfight only, the old school Daring's probably going to come out on top. Grab another super chat question and add it to the list. Yeah, IO2. It is basically, I am occasionally known to have traces of blood in my liquid sugar system. So Laser Pig very generously asks, I was told by a tour guide that one of the major problems with Bismarck was some of her equipment, like generators, batteries, etc., were built to factory standards, not naval standards, thus built to be on concrete floors and not steel decks, and weren't waterproof. Is there any truth in this? That's not one I've heard before, to be honest. I'd have to look into that in a lot more detail, and I will, because I am planning a video at some point on Bismarck and various things related to Bismarck. Those of you who met me on some of the ships will know kind of where I'm going with that. Let's just say it'll make a lot of people very angry. But with that said, just thinking over the stuff I have read about Bismarck, some of her equipment was very finicky and prone to breaking down a lot more than it should have done. So there may be an element of truth in that respect. As far as specifics, like generators and batteries, well, those kind of things, even if they're built to naval standards, don't tend to do too well when they're immersed in water and or set on fire. But so I'm not sure on the specifics, but I do know that some of her equipment, yes, was, shall we say, somewhat problematic when exposed to a saltwater environment, which it probably shouldn't have been. There were a number of changes made, both to what was installed on turpits and also what components were used to build the things installed on turpits. Part of that was technological advancement, but I suspect part of that might also be related to what you're talking about there. I'm actually going to move that question. Where am I going to put you? I'm going to pop that question down here. I am going to look into this further, and hopefully by the time of the next live stream I'll be able to offer you some additional information on that. I'm going to look very specifically into the areas that you have identified there, because it's something where I think my existing reading is circling on being able to possibly confirm or deny, but I wouldn't want to confirm or deny right this instant without a bit more digging, which is one of those really annoying little places to be, where you think you're just on the verge of being able to say something. CJ Knoll asks, had the US learned of the Yamato's true size in, say, late 39, would the Iowas have been quickly reordered as 30-knot plus Montanas? And if so, how would they fare in actual service? No. The work that would have been required to redesign the Iowas to maintain their speed and grab an extra turret, which would be the absolute minimum, or even dropping down to 30 knots and adding an extra turret, that would take far too long given the pressures of war to do the redesign for. And that's not even accounting for the fact, obviously, the Montanas were going to be more heavily armoured than the Iowas, and that would have to change as well. What you might see is the last two Iowas, which were obviously historically to be built as Iowas, you might see those reordered as Montanas and made priority. So you might see them rolling down the slipways maybe 6 months ahead of time compared to when their historical hulls kind of were almost ready, and they wouldn't be suspended. Well, they wouldn't be work suspended either, so actually they'd probably enter service a lot sooner, albeit right towards the end of the war, given that the historical Iowas weren't in service for too long in World War II. So yeah, an adapted sort of Montana, or straight up Montana, bearing the name Kentucky. Actually, that's going to be an interesting one, because without that, where are they going to get the spare bow when Wisconsin rams something? Questions for the ages. In terms of how they'd fare in actual service, well, like with the Iowas, they're not going to see a tremendous amount of service, but even less so, obviously, in World War II itself. Although as big 30-knot vessels, they might still be around and be museum ships these days, because their speed would allow them to be kept along, and their extra size would make them even better for reactivation for shorebomb bombing, because they've got 3 more guns and more space for more missiles. Whether that would mean 6 battleships, i.e. 4 Iowas, 2 Montana-ish ships, or whether they mothball or even scrap 2 of the Iowas and have 2 Iowas and 2 Montana types, who knows. But most of their service would lie post-1950. And people pointing out, yes, for a Montana you could have additional Essexes, but in late 39 no one's quite sure that building carriers to counter battleships is a 100% sure bet. Knight Heron Productions asks, all the Royal Navy carriers laid down by 1947 in real life are still built. All the war survivors are still about, but the Royal Navy also gets the 4 Maltas. What does the Royal Navy keep, scrap, or sell to the Commonwealth? Now, I think I vaguely remembered answering a question similar to this before. So, they'll keep Eagle and Ark Royal, the 2 Audacious's, and I think it's the Centaurs, which include Hermes. Pretty much everything else is going to get sold off. So, the Majestics, the Colossuses and Majestics, I mean, they got sold off quite a lot anyway. They'll probably get sold off even faster. The Illustriouses and Implacable, I think so. The Illustriouses and Implacables will go pretty quick. Most of the Colossuses and Majestics will also go pretty quick. The Bulwarks and Centaurs will stick around for a little bit before most of them will be sold on as well. And I suspect what you'll probably then have is a fleet that will be the 4 Maltas. Then you'll have Ark Royal and Eagle, and 2, probably Hermes and Centaur or something like that, wherein Ark Royal and Eagle are probably acting as your kind of spares and repairs backup carriers, and the Hermes and her sister ship will probably be acting as amphibious assault helicopter ships, or possibly the other way around. Maybe they'll be acting as the flight backup ships, and Ark Royal and Eagle will be the assault vessels. But I doubt it, because Ark Royal and Eagle will be able to operate aircraft that the Hermes and her sister ship wouldn't be able to. So yeah, I suspect you'll probably have your full Maltas supported by Audacious and Eagle acting as repair and support vessels, with 2 helicopter carriers, and so you'd have an 8-carrier Royal Navy fleet, which will probably eventually get cut down, but the Royal Navy will probably trade off one. They'd probably start off by trading off whichever one is more worn of Ark Royal and Eagle, then trade off Hermes and her sister, then trade off the other Audacious class, and try and ring fence the Maltas for as long as possible. William Kiefer asks, oh, my voice is going, this is annoying. William Kiefer asks, the asteroid that ended the Mesozoic strikes in the same place during 1942. How do you think the world navies would respond to the disaster? Automatically pretend that some of them survived. That would be a mess, to say the least. So basically talking about the Chicxulub, I think that's how it's pronounced, asteroid. Well, the US is on fire. Everyone's on fire. The US is especially on fire, but also underwater. I'm trying to think who on earth would survive. I mean, nothing in the Atlantic's going to be still around. Maybe some of the ships in the more sheltered parts of the Mediterranean would still be around, so elements of the Royal Navy and the Italian Navy. Maybe some stuff in the North Sea might be able to use the UK as a giant shield. A lot of the stuff in the Pacific is probably toast. A lot of it literally. Maybe stuff over in the Western Pacific hiding amongst the islands might survive. So there'd be a few elements of the US Navy in the Western Pacific still around. A bit of the Japanese Navy. The bits of the Royal Navy that are in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean and some of the North Sea would still be around. Weirdly enough, the Russians would probably suffer the least casualties. the Germans possibly and the Italians as well. They've got most of their navies concentrated in areas that are marginally possibly survivable, although probably not. Probably everybody just dies. But obviously, hopefully, the war would stop. But if an asteroid impact of that scale happened, how would they respond? There's not a lot they can do. Sail around looking for survivors. Hopefully. Hope that at least one oil refinery isn't on fire. I mean, they'd probably be in one of the better places. The crews would be in some of the better places to survive, at least for a little while. But eventually they'd just have to moor up and probably become their own little kingdoms. Thomas 1918 asks, how common was it for German U-boats to dive to the seabed to undertake repairs? Not that common. Ideally, you didn't want to operate in an area with a seabed that was shallow enough that you could actually dive down to it, if you could avoid it, because that meant you lacked operational depth and manoeuvre room, and meant the sea was probably fairly shallow anyway, which made it much more easy for you to be spotted. Plus, of course, you don't necessarily know what's below you when you go to the seabed. It could just be nice flat silt. It could be quicksand. It could be rocks. It could be a single rock that would punch through you. It could be a shipwreck. It could be an angled plane that you slide down or you end up on your side. But it's also a semi-decent hiding place occasionally. So, yeah, not very common, but they did do it a few times. Where they could guarantee that it would give them a stable place to sit. Jason Roth asks, the Battle of Jutland has changed slightly. The Germans have more ships. They are the first two Mackensons, Hindenburg, and all four Bayerns. How does this affect the battle? The Bayerns probably don't affect the battle all that much. The German fleet was strung out quite significantly, the High Seas Fleet, when the battle turnaway happened. The Helgolands, the Nassaus, and the Deutschlands were all hopelessly behind, which partly explained Scheer's decision to turn around, because he had basically what was left of First Scouting Group, the Kaisers and the Königs, to face the entire Grand Fleet. Adding in the four Bayerns to that equation doesn't really change all that much. The Royal Navy, the Grand Fleet, still has a massive preponderance of firepower, so that element, the battle turnaway, pretty much is probably as written in the history books. If you've got Hindenburg and two Mackensons, however, there's probably not much left of BT's command by the time the Queen Elizabeth show up. Probably Princess Royal and New Zealand are all that's left. The flip side is that the Queen Elizabeths are still more powerful than even the Mackensons, so it would all depend on timing, and who's done what damage to who by the time the QEs show up. But BT loses the battlecruiser flight even more decisively, and then it's kind of a coin toss between, do the QEs come in just quickly enough to rescue the situation and drive off First Scouting Group, and it will be more of an organised retreat than a full-length retreat, which is what was historically the case with when the QEs got involved. Or do they show up at the point in which there's basically none of the battlecruiser fleet left worth saving, at which point the QEs are significantly outnumbered and outgunned by the bulk of First Scouting Group, at which point they can do an awful lot of horrible damage, but will have to turn away pretty sharpish if they want to live. And of course, First Scouting Group overall are faster than the QEs, so if the QEs do turn away, they may try and pursue. Lars Petter Simonsen asks, why did sailing ships have such bluff bows? Was it for extra buoyancy to counteract the press of sails? And how could clipper ships do without them? A good chunk of it was structural. Naval architecture basically meant that they had to have fairly bluff bows. The way the framing and the ribbing and the planking worked. If you had a thin cutting profile bow like the clipper ships did for the majority of the age of sail, that would mean you just had a very, very weak bow that would start work open. You get a lot of flooding, and probably get your bow knocked off fairly quickly, and then you drown. Clipper ships came about after the Seppings and Simmons reforms, which I know mentioned quite a lot, where you were then able to use diagonal cross bracing and various other advances in naval architecture, which allowed you to have finer, more hydrodynamically shaped profiles for your ships, at which point something like the clipper bow was possible because it was now strong enough to withstand the forces being exerted on it, and thus off went the clipper ships. I mean, there is also a certain degree of the fact that, yes, you've got sails, particularly your foremast, pressing down on the ship, and lots of sails higher up, that there is a bit of a need for buoyancy and wet and such like there. But it's not as much as the architectural concerns surrounding ship design at the time. Excuse me. Galdia Eoni, naval history's most embarrassing fender bender. If we put that in the context of, just brushing in and, causing some damage, but both sides get to walk away to live another day. Given the tone of some of the court-martial documents, probably either the collision between, I think it was Washington and Indiana, South Dakota and Indiana, in World War II, or the interwar collision between, I think it was Renown and Hood, might have been Repulse and Hood, I think it was Renown, because in both of those cases it was, two large, fast capital ships had been manoeuvring perfectly well in company, and someone just really dropped the ball on both realising what was going on and responding to orders, and ended up with basically literally a slow motion train wreck, which then ended up with one or both ships having to go back to port for an entirely avoidable smash up. Whiskey Delta Golf. If 4 hoods were built, would the displacement limit at Washington have still been set at 35,000 tons, and would the other powers have built responses? It depends on the situation. If 4 hoods were built in addition to all the other Royal Navy stuff, then I suspect the displacement limit might still have been set at 35,000 tons, but I also suspect that the 4 hoods, or the admirals, would have been grouped into their own little unit and kind of given an exception clause, but then the other powers would have also been allowed to build responses to that. Whether they're in the same numbers or not, I don't know. That would be subject to a lot of negotiation and horse trading at the table. There was really a feeling that they wanted the 35,000 ton limit, and most people felt that most of Hood's additional displacement had gone into her speed rather than her firepower and durability, even though she was a top-of-the-line ship in those as well for the time. So I suspect you would have seen a clause vaguely similar to the one that allowed the US to convert Lexington and Saratoga into carriers, i.e., the US got the US gets to have 2 carriers that are a bit bigger than the standard displacement for carriers, but the standard displacement is still the standard displacement. It'll be a similar thing. The UK gets a bunch of battle cruisers that are above the standard displacement, but this is still standard displacement, but maybe with 4 of them, maybe each other power gets 2 of their own ships allowed through. So maybe the Japanese get Tosa and Kaga built as actual battleships. Don't know quite what would happen with the Americans, though, whether they'd want a South Dakota or 2, or whether they'd maybe complete the second 2 Lexingtons as battle cruisers. Who knows, something like that. Thomas 1918. During the blockade of Germany, how many ships were at sea at the same time, and where did they patrol? How many ships were at sea? Yes. So the blockade of Germany consisted of effectively two major operational areas. So you had the Channel Fleet, well, the Channel Force, Dover Patrol, which basically the Channel operational area. So you've got the Harwich Force, the Dover Patrol, and various associated ships patrolling up and down the English Channel. The Thames Estuary Guard Force, when it was eventually brought up to strength, also helped out there. So that was a combination of patrols to try and make sure the Germans didn't try and break out that way, guard vessels to guard the constant flow back and forth of transports to and from the UK and France, because obviously there's a land war going on, as well as anti-sub efforts to lay mines, nets, etc., hunt down the occasional sub. So there's several dozen ships at sea at any one time in that area, and then you have the Northern Barrage, which is a mixture of armed merchant, usually a mixture of armed merchant cruisers, trawlers, and regular cruisers, basically monitoring mostly for merchant shipping and keeping a weather eye out for any major German movements, but mostly involved with the anti-shipping stuff. And then the High Seas Fleet, the battle cruiser fleet, kind of operate within the environment set by those two lines for the most part to actually fight German warships. But there might be anything from a dozen to several dozen ships out on the northern blockade at any one time as well, depending on the time period, the weather, etc. So blockade duty of Germany in World War One, probably the minimum number of ships at sea associated with that at any given time was probably about 3 dozen, and it could be well over 100 at certain times. And that's it. That's only if you count the stuff that's specifically, this is here for the blockade and nothing else. Because, of course, there are patrols and sweeps by the Grand Fleet that are in support of the blockade but not directly tied to it, which, of course, that involves several hundred ships in and of itself. Pedden Harley asks, at the moment of her commissioning in 1878, HMS Gannet and her crew are sent to 1778. How useful a combatant is she in 1778, and how possible is it for the Royal Navy dockyards to keep her operational? Well, as a composite vessel, keeping her operational to a degree should be fairly easy because she has sails. They know how to maintain and maintain those. She's got pretty much a hull that they also understand how to maintain, so that part's not too bad. Her engines might be a bit more problematic, and they'll last until they break down. The technology to manufacture replacement parts is there. Whether the expertise to identify which parts need to be manufactured and how to install them is another matter. If she's got a particularly skilled engineer on board who understands her engines front to back, he can probably keep the engines going by commissioning specific replacement parts. But if not, then her engine will probably give up the ghost at some point. Whilst her engine is in operation, she'll be a very useful scout vessel, especially off the enemy coast during blockades. In terms of being a useful combatant, she's not going to be tremendously useful in a straight-up gun battle. Yes, she has guns that are very big and very powerful compared to the regular 32-pounder cannon, but she doesn't have a tremendous number of them, which could lead and she's not particularly large either, which would lead her being overwhelmed by short-range gunfire pretty quickly. Obviously, she is still fighting within visual range. She's got some Nordenfeldts, quad-barrel Nordenfeldts. Those would be very useful for boarding action. So I suspect she would probably be used as initially a scouting vessel off the French coast, because she can basically go wherever she likes until the steam engine stops working. And later on, and either later on generally or possibly after her steam engine stopped working, they may well then stick her out on raiding duty, particularly going after specific key targets, because if she's going after things like the Spanish Manila galleon, various other high-value vessels, She can probably chase most of them down, especially, obviously, if the engine's working in contrary wind conditions. And she's got the firepower to easily take on merchant ships. And if she is attacked by frigates, well, she's got these big guns. A couple of hits to a frigate will probably do fairly nasty things. And if the frigate tries to get in close, those Nordenfelds will make a fair mess of her opponent's deck crews. But yeah, she'd probably end up with as a good raiding frigate for the longest time. Melanie 16040. HMS Gannet is a preserved Victorian composite sloop in Chatham Dockyard. She's from the latter part of the 1800s. CJ Knoll asks, could the Bismarcks have been fitted with triple 15-inch turrets? Only if Krupp abandons the idea of the horizontal sliding breech, which was one of the bigger reasons for why the Bismarck's turrets were so large. Theoretically, her size would allow for a triple 15-inch turret to be fitted, but it would have to be of an interrupted screw breech design, i.e. Krupp would have to get with the modern times. Look at the length and beam of Bismarck compared to the length and beam of Richelieu. Richelieu could fit quad 15s. So yeah, there's space for triple 15s as long as your gun design allows you to fit them somewhat reasonably close together, which the Krupp guns don't allow for. Chazix asks, the Admiralty, after reading War of the Worlds, would they order a torpedo ram design in 1939? Okay, I think he says, after reading War of the Worlds, the Admiralty orders a torpedo ram design in 1939. What do you think it would look like, and would it have been built? Torpedo ram? No, they wouldn't have built it in 1939. The ramming concept was long dead. But if they were going to do a torpedo something, a son of Thunderchild in 1939, if I was going to go for all the torpedoes all the time, using and adapting an existing Royal Navy design, I would probably take the fast mine layers. So that's, Manxman, Welshman, Abdiel. So the Abdiel class fast mine layers. Take them as a basis, and then instead of that massive mine laying deck that they were fitted with, put as many quad or quintuple torpedo launchers as I could. So something to make Kitakami envious, and send that in, because if they go steaming along at night, low profile, 40 knots, I'm pretty sure they could get up close and personal to a bunch of stuff and then send out a massive wave of torpedoes and then turn around and leg it before anyone knows what's going on. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, would the side breech work if the Germans had turned it sideways like the British did with the Firefly's tank gun? I.e., if they'd gone with a vertical sliding breech. Could be done. Might lead to some interesting and restricted loading angles, but yeah, it could be done. Turret height would become a bit of an issue, I suspect, though. Excuse me. Right. Yeah, that's bit of a thing to be struggling with at the moment. Sorry. Paul Amos, when was HMS Belfast last dry docked, and is it due soon? I think it was last dry docked in the late 90s, early 2000s. It hasn't been dry docked for a while. Is it due soon? Not as far as I'm aware. I think, if I remember last time I was on Belfast, it's not due for another dry docking until at least the latter part of this decade, possibly beginning of next. So yeah. Box Ghost 102, Nassau versus Corbeil. Tegethoff versus Gangut. So, as built, the Nassau has an advantage over the Corbeil in that, despite the fact they're both relatively limited on range, Nassau can outrange Corbeil. I mean, any dreadnought can outrange Corbeil, but Nassau can do so. And in the slap fight of the bottom feeders, yeah, Nassau does also have the option of just rotating 180 degrees to present a near undamaged broadside if the going gets a little bit too bad. I mean, it'll be a close fight, but I'd say Nassau has a slight edge over Corbeil. Tegethoff versus Gangut, as built, with all the quality control issues that inherent, the Gangut has the advantage. Purely by paper specs, if both built by the same shipyard, I think the Tegethoff might have an edge, but with the historical build quality, at least in the early part of the war, the Gangut would have the advantage. Theoretically, once the issues are resolved after the bombardment of Ancona, the Tegethoffs would move back into having an advantage, but then the Tegethoffs suffer from the neglect that is the latter part of the war for the Austro-Hungarian Navy. Not that some of the Russian ships were in particularly good shape at the end either. So yeah, that's a very difficult one to pull together. But they're both fairly close fights. But I'd say Nassau has more of an advantage in the first fight than in the second. Than there is an advantage in the second one. But I'd be tempted in a real world fight to kind of maybe edge it just a little bit in Gangut's favour. Martin Sandal Eskilsen asks, is there a chance you could do a video or maybe visit HDMS Jylland, or maybe a video about some other Danish Age of Sail ship? I do want to visit the Jylland at some point, and then I will do a video on her, because she's there, so there's no point in doing a video about her without visiting. That would just be silly. Prince of Tonga asks, if diesel engine tech had advanced faster, would the Royal Navy look at it seriously for post-World War I capital ships, as the efficiency improvements could be useful with a worldwide empire to guard? Maybe it would have to advance an awful lot, though, because whilst the advances that saw some diesel engines deployed in ships in the Second World War were obviously relatively considerable, steam turbines still had a number of advantages in terms of responsiveness, total power output, energy density in terms of horsepower per ton and horsepower per cubic meter. So it would have to be a lot of advances. I mean, obviously diesel took over from steam turbines in a lot of cases in the Cold War for a reason, but it would have to be made. If you're looking at it for post-World War I capital ships, then no, I don't think the tech could plausibly advance fast enough to overcome all of the major concerns the Royal Navy would have. Maybe if you were looking at advancing mid-1930s diesel technology to, let's say, mid-1950s, early 1960s diesel tech, that might be an argument. But advancing early 1920s diesel tech to, say, late 30s, early 40s diesel tech, I don't think there's enough of an improvement there. And Tevildo asks, where can we find good illustrations of ship-based torpedo tubes? They're significant, but I can never envisage how they work. So there is a book which helpfully is called Torpedo. Yeah, there you go, Torpedo. So there's Torpedo, the complete history of the world's most revolutionary naval weapon. And there's also, usefully, also called Torpedo by Catherine C. Epstein. They're the two kind of main go-to books for references on torpedoes. Beyond that, There are various plans and diagrams of individual ships' torpedo tubes. I think a lot of it would depend on whether you're looking for the torpedo tubes of destroyers, or cruisers, i.e. the rotating top-mounted, deck-mounted torpedo launchers, or the torpedo launchers installed in capital ships, the underwater ones that are, or even above water ones that are built into the hull, because they're both ship-based torpedo tubes. For hull-mounted torpedo tubes, there's apart from those books, there's also some reasonably good plans and illustrations for latter part of 19th century, early 20th century ships equipped with such equipment. There's some plans available online. For the deck-mounted stuff, that probably US Navy operational manuals for theirs are probably one of the better places to go. Yeah, if you want to drop me a email or a Discord message, then at some point next week I will try and send you some of the plans and so forth that I've got access to, that I've got sitting around on my hard drive, or at least pictures from books if those aren't the ones you're looking for. So I think that is all caught up. As I said, I need to get back on Charles Fitt and Doctor Irrelevance questions, which I'll come back to in the live stream in the mid-month, and Laser Pig I'm going to look into your question about generators, batteries, etc. on Bismarck in more detail, and again come back to that then. Let me close that. Let me then move that slightly. Keaton Alexander, what's your opinion and thoughts on books by Osprey Publishing, and how do you like your gaming chair versus other chairs? Well, I can sit in this chair for 8-10 hours at a time if necessary on a long day working on the channel, without feeling like my back's going to seize up and kill me. So there's that. I mean, I have installed sheepskins on it, so I guess it's not 100% perfect. I'm thinking of maybe getting a little bit more cushioning, because the sheepskin that I'm sitting on is beginning to look a little bit flat and sad. Yeah, so compared to other chairs, it's very, very good. There is a reason I have it. Books by Osprey Publishing. They can be good. They can be not so good. It depends quite a lot on the author. Where they are... yeah, I think with the Osprey series, some of them are very, very useful. Some of them you do have to be a little bit careful of, but they can be useful as more general histories. I would say probably your first stop would be to, if you're thinking about which Osprey books do you want to have a look at who the authors are, look up the authors, see what else they've published first, and then make a decision based on that. I do use them for references occasionally, the ones that are by the better authors. They are obviously quite small. They're quite short. They don't contain a massive amount of information, but they're good little primers when they are good. And there's more good there's more good than bad. All right. Now, with that, I have half a glass of iron brew. Flip's sake. I live in a cul-de-sac, and some people just think that motorcycles running up and down a cul-de-sac are the best thing since sliced bread. Right. Where are we? Okay, I'm going to start taking questions basically from the chat, starting from Keaton Alexander's question. So if you have a question you'd like me to answer, basically, I guess type it in now. I'll work my way through them as quickly as I can, as best I can. As I say, I do have this lingering pollen attack, which is not helping. So we will probably wrap up a little bit earlier than normal. It's also 9:30 and I'm still a little bit jet lagged, believe it or not. Anyway, Sambo, have you ever visited Plymouth, southwest England? Yes, very briefly. I've been past it a lot of times, but I've only ever popped into it once, and as I say, very briefly. Monkey of the Smack 419, if Brazil hadn't imploded in the early 20th century, do you think they would have become an actual player on the world scene during either World War? Not by World War One. There's just not enough time, and they're still ordering everything in. If for whatever reason their economy didn't implode and they worked on and built on it, got their own industry and infrastructure going, being able to build and maintain their own capital ships, etc., then by World War Two, they've got the potential maybe to become a strong regional power. They wouldn't be a US, UK, Japan level power, but they would have their own battle fleet, and both sides would be courting them because of the amount of control that they can exert over the South Atlantic. So yeah, they'd be a strong regional power. I don't think they would have quite ascended to global power status by that point. You'd probably be looking at them with a navy maybe a little bit smaller than, but are beginning to approach the capabilities of the French Navy. Maybe sort of 70-80% the size. So definitely someone you want on your side, but not individually somebody that the big powers fear. IO2, perhaps a bit outside the channel's time frame, but what would the butterflies be of the Royal Navy choosing to build 3 Minotaur-class cruisers instead of the Tigers? I mean, they'd be better suited for conversion to that horrific box structure they stuck on the back of the Tiger and Blake. They'd be a lot more capable ships, but they'd also be a lot more expensive to run because they're larger. So I suspect you'd probably see them... You might see them decommissioned... You might see one of them decommissioned a bit quickly, leaving two, but with their size and capabilities, they do make excellent Sverdlov killers and such like, so they may well be kept around for that. That's probably going to mean fewer towns and crown colonies kept around. See, at their size, you could actually... With them being just that little bit bigger, you could actually legitimately make them decent helicopter carriers by converting their aft sections, as opposed to the Tigers, where it never really quite worked. And they'd still retain a lot of decent forward firepower. Of course, that leads to the inevitable question of would they have been around for the Falklands? Maybe. Their size also means they could take missile conversions a bit easier, so you might see them converted into kind of a helicopter missile cruiser hybrid with a gun, maybe a couple of guns left, somewhat similar to what the US did to some of its cruisers in the 50s and 60s, and then used as escorts for Ark Royal and Eagle, which means they'll probably go out of service around with the same time as Ark Royal or thereabouts, or they might keep one along to escort the Invincibles. So there's maybe a fractionally larger chance of a single Minotaur getting down to the Falklands, but maybe, maybe not. Sean Riley asks, how would USS Washington fare in her famous battle if Yamato was there instead of Kirishima? Well, at the 9,000 yards, Washington can still punch shells into Yamato unless Yamato's at an odd angle. So Yamato's still going to take a huge amount of damage. South Dakota's in a lot of trouble because, well, an 18.1 inch shells are going to do a real mess, even if they're HE. And obviously Kirishima switched between the two during her assault on South Dakota, so I think South Dakota's going to come off a lot worse. The number of hits that Washington put into Kirishima, though, Yamato will still be there. She'll still be in somewhat fighting order, but she'll be grievously wounded. With something that size, though, I think Lee won't check fire after 27 rounds. He'll keep pumping rounds in, and he better, because basically he needs to hit Yamato hard and keep hitting her hard in such a way that she never gets a chance to fight back, because if South Dakota's going to have problems, dealing with incoming fire from Yamato. Washington is going to have even more problems because he's even less well protected. And Yamato has some pretty nice fire control, even for night fighting. So that's going to be, yeah, I think it's going to turn on basically, can Lee keep hitting Yamato enough to keep her off balance, either long enough to do completely fatal damage or long enough for Washington to slip away. I don't think Yamato would survive particularly long afterwards, but it would be more like a Hiei style and then limps away and is eventually sunk the next day, rather than Kirishima's sort of rolling over after a few extra hits. Oh wow, that's a big jump in questions. Say No More asks, do you have any experience with the Danish coastal battleship designs of 1936 to 39? And if so, how would you imagine their performance ignoring the political situation in Denmark in the 30s? I do have a couple of reference books that go over the proposals, but off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you all that much about them. I would have to read up on them a bit more. Thank you, William Potts. I have seen Laser Pigs one. It is actually just at the bottom of my screen now. Vigis Ricks asks, opinion on salt sticks? I don't know. I don't think I've ever had some. Spencer Madsen, did American battleships use common-semi-armor piercing shells in World War II? No, I don't think anybody did. The CPC shells that British battleships had in World War I seem to have been mostly unique to them. Common can mean HE in certain definitions. So in that sense, yes, they had HE shells. But in the sense of common as in basic armor piercing, semi-armor piercing, no. Les Bien Pa asks, do you have any plans for the 500th year anniversary of the Swedish Navy next month? Not particularly, unless someone with expertise in that area wants to reach out. I do have a relatively full schedule of video production for this month and next month, because obviously while I was in the States I wasn't able to produce the 2 videos a month that Patreon normally voted on, so I had to produce everything of my own initiative, which means that one video that they would have selected last month gets published this month, and the other video gets published next month. So I have 3 videos Patreon selected each month, and 1 video of my own, and the 1 video of my own for next month that I've already chosen. Laserpig asks, since I'm still here and doing a video on this, and I could briefly use you to check my facts, is there any truth to the idea that when the Cap Trafalgar fought the Cambria in 1914, both ships were disguised as each other? I actually did a video on this. Let me pull it up. Well, I did a video that mentioned this. Yeah. So, copy link. So I'm just going to put that link in chat. Sorry, it's got a timestamp on it. I don't know why. But yes, there's armed merchant cruisers and raiders bearing deadly cargo. That's a video I did a couple of years ago. I actually go over the Cap Trafalgar engagement in a fair amount of detail, and there should be, let me just double check before I speak out of turn. Okay, for some reason they didn't list the sources in there. But yeah, so that goes into the engagement in a lot more depth than I'd be able to go in just a live dry dock. But that will address the issue. Cap Trafalgar was disguised. If I recall correctly off the top of my head, the British ship wasn't disguised as Cap Trafalgar, but did resemble her to a certain degree. I'm just checking this. Where's the script gone? Carmania, that's the ship. Yeah, so it's so basically Carmania resembled Cap Trafalgar in her disguise, because obviously Cap Trafalgar was disguised as Carmania, but Carmania wasn't disguised as Cap Trafalgar because basically Carmania was a two-funnel ship, and Cap Trafalgar had to take some fairly extensive modifications to more closely resemble Carmania. Carmania had no reason to disguise herself as a German ocean liner. So they very closely resembled each other, but that was because of Cap Trafalgar's disguise, not Carmania's. Not Carmania also doing a disguise. But as I say, that the video I've linked in the chat, that should give you a little bit more detail about the battle. And obviously, feel free to drop me a line at some point, email, Discord, etc. If you'd like to check any further facts or get sources, etc. I'm perfectly happy to help out with that. So I just had to quickly check the script. Fortunately, most of my scripts are stored in the same file. Chuck Marble says, "Hey Drac, many of your subs have listened to you for countless hours to the point we actually think of you as a good friend, even those that never met you. Does that seem weird to you?" Not particularly, to be honest. I've come across many weird things in my life that are a lot weirder than that, and I mean, yeah, it's obviously a little bit of a one-way street, but hopefully, as people found when I was on the various ships, I'm hopefully relatively approachable and friendly generally. So yeah, it seems fine to me. I mean, I also understand where you're coming from, because way back in the day, I used to watch an awful lot of Total Biscuit's channel, may he rest in peace, to the point that when he eventually came over to the UK for a number of conventions, I met him a couple of times along with the rest of the Co-optional podcast crew, as it then was. And yeah, you get the feeling that if you've listened to someone speak for hours and hours and hours and hours on end on something they're very passionate about, you do kind of get an inkling of what they might be like in person. And I mean, of course, you then also have to take that and run with it and okay, well, I'm now going to adapt how I interact with them on this basis, and obviously be polite and respectful. But I'm happy to report that when I did meet them, the whole crew, especially Total Biscuit, at the various conventions, they were fairly friendly and we got on fairly well. I was one of a few that managed to get invited to hang around after one of the conventions, and I got a fairly nice poster of my own design which got everybody's signature on. So yeah, they're generally nice people, so hopefully I'm following in those footsteps. And I mean, the fact that I've managed to help people with the countless hours of work, well, that's a big plus for me. Christopher Abernathy, favourite rifle and rifle caliber. If I had to be perfectly honest, the Martini Henry in 5.77-45. It's just a hilariously fun gun. Admittedly, yeah, there is a little bit of the whole late Victorian desire for reenacting Empire go probably in there somewhere, but no, seriously, I really like the lever action. I really like the Winchester as well. The Winchester lever action in 45. It works really well for, and I think, I know this sounds like a crime, but I think I almost prefer lever action over bolt action. That may also be the fact that I'm left-handed, so most bolt actions usually involve trying to desperately avoid punching myself in the face, whereas lever actions are somewhat more forgiving on that ground. The only thing I'd say is the Martini Henry in 5.77-45 kicks like a beast. So caliber, I'm not so sure about. I've had the most accuracy with 7mm Mauser, but I think that's more the gun than the ammunition. So I don't think I have a particularly favourite calibre, but definitely the Martini Henry is my favourite rifle so far. I wonder if they do... Yeah, I know they do Martini... Yes, they know. What am I saying? Of course they do Martini Henrys in 303, so maybe that'll be my next ambition. Who knows? Excuse me. White Health. Oh, yeah, I had my phone on silent, and the silent only lasts 2 hours, and since we've been going for 2 hours 33 minutes, it's worn off again. Let me put it back on. There we go. Nothing immediately urgent. Where are we? IO2, the year is 1935, and somehow the turrets and guns of the Invincibles and Indefatigables are found in good condition in a Royal Navy warehouse. What ships do you choose to build? Okay, so I've got twin 12s. In 1935, the treaty systems collapsed and I've got a bunch of twin 12s. To be honest, the realistic Royal Navy is probably going to stick them on a bunch of monitors. They are somewhat old. With the supply of guns in place, I can see somebody coming up with some kind of supercruiser idea, because, I mean, they were looking at various 12-inch gunned mini battleships and supercruisers in the 1930s. So if they've got a ton of twin 12s, I can see them maybe sticking together maybe a 6-gun 18 to 20,000 ton supercruiser or two. Just grab that question over there. Yeah, if I had my choice, I'd probably build like basically mini Renowns, 6 12-inch guns, probably about 20 to 22,000 tons, running around at high speed. Good cruiser killers, good for dealing with things like the, well, Hippers and Deutschlands, etc. Yes, they're never going to tangle with the Scharnhorst or whatever, but let's face it, that's what you have the proper capital ships for. Oh yeah, Keaton Alexander. The other thing I would say with a secret lab chair is, if you can, have it backing onto open space. Now, due to space and location constraints over here in this particular area, obviously this backs onto shelves, but they are actually ridiculously comfortable to just lie down and vegetate in, because they can basically lean back fully. I just can't do it here, which is a little bit annoying. Maybe at some day I'll reorganize everything so that I can. William Kirchmeyer asks, what was the worst naval boiler casualty you have knowledge of? That's a matter of some debate. Thunderer's boiler explosion back in the 1880s was not pleasant at all. 1870s, 1880s, somewhere around that time. But, I mean, technically speaking, there's a decent argument to be made in a number of ship sinkings that the boilers cooked off then, which would obviously be the worst. There is a theory, which I'm somewhat subscribed to. I need to look at it in more detail before I 100% commit myself to, but there is a theory I've seen going around that Barham's magazine explosion was kicked off by water going down the funnels and exploding the boilers, which then exploded the magazines. As I say, there is a degree of circumstantial evidence in the video of her destruction that might support that. But, yeah, as I say, I need to do a bit more. But if so, that would be the worst naval boiler casualty, technically. I mean, she's already sinking, but there's sinking and then there's exploding. The man formerly known as Commenting is What I Do says, if the High Seas Fleet wasn't scuttled at Scapa Flow, but the Washington Treaty goes through relatively unchanged, what ships would the German Navy choose for modernisation, and what would they do? Well, they get pretty much what they got historically, because the separate to the Washington Treaty, the Versailles Treaty restricted the Germans' navy. The Washington Treaty didn't even have Germany at the table because they weren't a serious naval power by the early 1920s. So the Germans would be stuck with basically the same ships they had historically because they're not allowed anything bigger, unfortunately. Where the High Seas Fleet at Scapa Flow would just be divvied up to scrap merchants and various other fleets for war prizes. You'd have to completely change the Washington Treaty and the Versailles Treaty to allow the Germans to have anything more modern than what they historically got, apart from maybe the odd cruiser here and there. Let's see. Jake Miller asks, if not for Admiral Nelson, who would we remember and name streets after? There's a fair number of other admirals. I mean, there's plenty of Hawks and Hansons and Howes and so forth scattered around. Vernon as well. There's a fair number of Royal Navy admirals who have stuff named after them. It's just that Nelson kind of put them all in the shade a little bit. Ian, I'm probably going to have to wrap this up soon because my nose is beginning to play up majorly. I don't think talking helps. Ian Winter, could they have fitted triple 15-inch turrets on the QEs as part of their rebuilds? And that would have made them very powerful. Not really. The British 15-inch turrets were already pretty compact. As part of their rebuilds, you see, as designed, you probably could have fitted triple 15s, but you would have needed a larger barbette. I think the hull could probably just about accommodate it. So yeah, you could have gotten it into the QEs as part of their original build, maybe. But no, once in their rebuilds, the barbette's fixed, the shell handling arrangements are fixed. Basically, without completely ripping apart the ship and effectively building a new one from scratch, you're not going to get that in. Right. Thomas 1918, why were Lion, Princess Royal and Queen Mary called the Splendid Cats? Well, you kind of have to append Tiger to that as well. It's basically because of Lion initially and the fact that the Lion class battle cruisers, they kind of got running with a cat theme, even though, as you point out, until Tiger came in, actually 2 of the 3 didn't carry cat-related names at all. But with Lion and Tiger in there, they're like, oh yeah, we'll go with this. We'll go with this kind of moniker. Daniel Taylor, any chance for an Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts build guide of some sort on a fun Friday? I did do some live streams covering Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts way back in the day when it was in a much earlier form. Maybe at some point I'll get back to that. Yeah, I mean, I am still keeping up with Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. I do find it quite fun. I've developed a few little timeline sets of design on there as well. So yeah, maybe at some point I'll revisit that. Probably in the summer though, because having worked my backside off in March to generate basically 2 months worth of content in 1 month so that I could go to America, I've now still got to generate like an additional 2 weeks of content this month, and we're already a week into it, so that I can go to Canada in June, which is going to be fun. Samuel John asks, I'm trying to develop the naval lore of my fantasy setting. What sources would you recommend for the design, theory, or history for each major era of shipping, military and economic? Economic, I'm afraid I'm not an economic historian, so there wouldn't... I'm not... Unless you're looking specifically for naval economics. Design theory, though. I'd say drop me a Discord DM or an email, because that's a very complicated question, and I would have to go through my library and check specifically which particular books I would recommend, and also check exactly what you're looking for in terms of design theory, rather than just listing off. This is one of the disadvantages of moving almost all my books up to my library. Before, I had at least 2 bookshelves, so I could just look left and right. Okay, this is my quick reference stuff. I can at least pull something off of there. Now it's all up in the library. Unless you want me to disappear for 5 minutes, it's not going to happen. Maybe I should have like a little camera system there. Jerome Birth, when are you visiting the Missouri... Oh, what the... banana? I don't know where that went, but I think someone was asking, when am I going to visit Missouri and Pearl Harbor? In theory, next year when I do Drac Tour Mark II, probably around the same time. But yeah, I definitely will be visiting Pearl Harbor on that particular tour. I don't know exactly what the rest of the tour is going to look like just yet. Miles McCaskill asks, did you get a chance to ride Pirates of the Caribbean while you were at Disneyland? No, it was shut. That was very sad. I did get to have a lightsaber fight with Mrs. Drac up and down the lanes, though, which Disney security were not very impressed with. Chuck Marble, Drac, will you be adding more of your used surplus naval history books for sale on your website? And would you be willing to sign them for your buyers? Yes and yes. That will probably happen towards the end of next week. I will make a community post announcement about it. It'll be either be end of next week or beginning of the week after. I have, like, if I put them all together, like an 8-foot stack of spares to dispose of. And yeah, if someone wanted a signature or anything, then just leave a message with the purchase. And as with the first 2 test ones, I'll be doing them at a reasonably decent discount compared to current market value. And there's some pretty nice ones in there as well. I don't know how I've wound up with some of those in duplicate, but I guess I did somehow. Of course I know who you are, Laser Pig. With a name like that, how could I not? It's not a name that leaves the mind easily, and I approve greatly. Hang on a sec. Mrs. Drac, are you able to be mobile?
In theory.
Could you retrieve the blade?
Which blade?
The one we got in Disney. It's in the hallway. Plasma Burn Death saying, what kind of travel tourist gifts did you buy from the US? Well, if you were here at the beginning, I don't know if you saw the hats. There's a good chunk more hats where that came from on their way in another box. For those of you who are keeping track on Twitter and on the YouTube community post, I stole the Declaration of Independence whilst disguised as Nick Cage, so of course nobody knew who I was. A funny story for that. I'll have to tell it during the post-America debrief anyway. Other travel tourist gifts, I mean, I was mostly obviously on ships, so I got mostly that stuff. Thank you. And people were giving me a lot of stuff very kindly as well. I'm putting together a little board and collection of the stuff that people have given me, sort of pins and coins and stuff, so they're properly preserved. But of course, there was also this thing. Because yes, I went to Disneyland, so of course I spent pretty much the entirety of my time in Disneyland in the Star Wars section, because of course I did. So yeah, custom built lightsabers. They're fun. That's my one. Mrs. Drek has her own. And my little camera crew, which some of you may have met, also got their own. So that was quite fun. I got a few decent books as well. I also learned it costs an absolute fortune to ship stuff home, and you're actually much better off just buying a suitcase and taking it in hold luggage. Right, 21:56. We're coming up to 3 hours. There's a few more super chats I need to get to. So I'm going to do those. And just making sure I didn't miss any of the super chats. Jeff Barney says, favourite ship you visited in America, in case it wasn't already asked. It's not a question, I told people on the ships as well, there's not a question I can specifically answer. Each ship was unique in its own way. Each ship displayed certain things in certain ways. You know, of course, on New Jersey, I got the complete run of the place. It was absolutely fantastic running around the ship with Ryan. It's like, can we go there? Yes, we can. And I got a little bit of vertigo trying to climb into a funnel stack in the middle of a high wind. And my camera crew nearly got drowned by a storm, so it was a very memorable visit. But, you know, in USS Salem, for example, I got to climb down through the gun turret system and loading system, all the way from the turrets down through the loading mechanisms, all the way down into the shell handling rooms, which is a very unique experience in and of itself. Alabama's covered in 20mm and 40mm guns, and you know, and the people on board, to be honest, the people on board the ships make the experience, because a ship is a ship is a ship. There's a certain amount you can learn from the physical reality of it, but the people who come to see me and the people aboard the ship, the staff, the docents, the curators, they made each and every experience on board all of the ships absolutely unique. And I mean, yeah, there be things that I personally preferred, but I think to say, well, this was my favourite, I think we'll probably do a disservice to all the other people on all the other ships who made my stays so wonderful. I mean, it's possibly one of the most enjoyable holidays I've ever taken, even though I was running my feet most of the time. Aluminium fence, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I mean, as we all know, you know, Star Wars has only had 7 major films, and then you've got Rogue One and Solo. But, you know, we'll never know what the 8th and 9th episodes of Star Wars would have been like after everybody tragically died at the conclusion of Episode 7. And yes, I do actually have proper dueling spec lightsabers as well. I think these ones can be used for light sparring, but I have actual proper spec ones that you could use to hammer into each other full on HEMA style. Right. Let's go. William Kiefer would you be interested in one day visiting USS Requin in Pittsburgh? As it's the Carnegie Science Center and it's the last of a particular kind of submarine. Sure, at some point when I can get there. To Vildo, the holiday special isn't a part of the episode continuity. Okay, I'm just going to do the super chat questions and then wrap up with a few last questions from the chat. Jack Ray says, I heard Athias' telling of how he met you at the aircraft carrier. It sounded quite funny. Yes, it was absolutely freaking hilarious. And Athias and crew are absolutely fantastic, great people as well. Again, an absolutely wonderful day. And hey, I got introduced to the realm of the real firearm, which, you know, was not necessarily a bad thing. Especially when at least no one was yelling at me telling me I was the worst shot ever, which was always a plus. Right, so the other super chats. Miles McCaskill asks, examples of massive internal corruption that resulted in paper tiger navies, for example, a government allocating funds for salaries, but those funds were skimmed and no sailors were ever hired. The Royal Navy, at points, between its founding in the Tudor period, all the way through to probably as late as the part of the 18th century, it had serious problems of every so often slipping into a mass of horrific internal corruption. I mean, there was still a lot of internal corruption when the Napoleonic Wars broke out, but it was a lot more under control than it had been even 30, 40 years before. I mean, it's one of the uncomfortable truths about the Spanish Armada conflict that the English fleet was held off of the coast, even though illness was spreading through the fleet after the Armada had disappeared around Scotland. And the admirals and the captains were begging to have their crews put ashore so that they could recover. And the official excuse given by the Crown was that no, they need to stay out there just in case the Spanish come back. Unofficially, the more sailors who died, the fewer that had to be paid, which is horrific, but also true, unfortunately. And I mean, like, people like Admirals Hawke and Vernon had to deal with being given ships and told, right, you need to go and do this, and being finding that the ships were basically barely afloat and barely manned and not supplied, even though on paper they were. So, the Royal Navy has its fair share of that through history. More close to the present day, the Chinese Navy at the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Navy, the Brazilian Navy after a certain point in the late 1900s, early 1910s, the Russian Navy in the 20s and 30s. It comes and goes across all sorts of different navies. Frank Spazzato, for an alt history, how would the Doolittle raid have gone if the US Navy had used a Lexington class instead? Why didn't they, and should they have done so? They didn't use one because Lexington had gone boom, and hang on. No, timeline's wrong on that, sorry. No, Lexington hadn't gone boom. Lexington went boom around the time of the Doolittle raid, because you had Coral Sea being fought by Lexington and Yorktown. Saratoga had been damaged, I believe, and Hornet and Enterprise was left to do the Doolittle raid. How would the Doolittle raid have gone if they'd used Lexington class? Not much different. I mean, the launch point would have been the same. The success rate in launch would have been the same. It would have been slightly easier, probably, to launch, but they got the planes off anyway. Maybe with the Lexington class, they could have afforded to leave a little bit more fuel in there, so maybe more of the bombers would have gotten to somewhere close to their target point to land, but I kind of doubt it a bit. In terms of why didn't they? Well, considering the size and capabilities of a Lexington, apart from anything, they're quite valuable in theatre. It's also a matter of what's available. Lexington and Saratoga were out in the Pacific fighting, or Saratoga's case in repairs. Hornet, which of course was the carrier that actually launched it, was completing on the East Coast, so it was in a position to swing by and pick up the bombers as it headed out into the Pacific, whereas for any of the other carriers, you would have had to pull them off duty, bring them back to the US, load them up, and take them back out again. In terms of should they have done so, I don't think it would have made an awful lot of difference, to be perfectly honest. As I say, that there's an outside chance that if they'd done it with the slightly larger Lexingtons in mind, they might have been able to get a bit more fuel aboard, but at the same time, they might have then also decided maybe to leave some of the more defensive equipment in place instead and still have the same amount of fuel. So, yeah. Mr. Flintlock, what's your favourite act of valour or greatest feat of daring at sea? That's a good question. I think it probably has to be the last stand of the Revenge, which I have done a video on. That's in the Age of Sail in the Elizabethan era. it takes a special kind of someone. I mean, admittedly, Grenville had screwed up massively to be in that situation in the first place, but it does take a special kind of someone to look at a 50-strong enemy fleet, most of which are bigger than you, and go, yep, we're going to fight these guys, and we're going to keep fighting them until it's basically physically impossible to continue fighting. That would probably be that's got to be my top one, just in terms of sheer insanity of defying the odds. Jeff Barney, have you seen the immunity zone chart thread using the Oakham program on the NavWeb's forum? Excuse me. It's a wealth of information. I think I have. If they're the one, if I'm thinking of the right one, that's the chart that basically shows the top-down profile of a ship like this, and then it shows kind of something that looks a little bit like a bell curve running along underneath. It's not quite a bell curve, but it's basically the range at which a given projectile can successfully penetrate, and the reason for the change is that the angle of the ship. So basically, if the ship is turned like 80 degrees, then gradually coming through to perfectly broadside and then going back again. If that's the one you mean, then yes, I have seen elements of that thread. I think possibly on the forum, maybe elsewhere. I'm not an active member of that forum though, so I don't think I may have seen the thread years ago when I used to be on there under a random username, but who knows. But yeah, I have seen elements of that, if that's what we're talking about. Now you're saying for deck versus belt penetration. Okay, yeah, I think we're on the same page. Yeah. Yeah, I have seen that. I do quite like that. It is a very, very useful resource, as you mentioned, because it shows not just as you can get in most tables, which either assume broadside or assume a specific angle. Most of the time assume broadside, and a specific range. Something that someone with more programming skills than me needs to do at some point is contact Nathan Oken and get permission from him in the first place, but take Face Hard and transliterate it into a modern programming format, because obviously at the moment you have to use DOSBox to run it. But if it could be translated into a modern program format, maybe given some basic 3D animation as well, then you could basically live generate views of different ships' full immunity zones, because modern computer power could easily run all the calculations pretty much like that, I'm pretty sure. And then you could import basic, even if it's just a silhouette or 2D plan of an Iowa, a Yamato, a Bismarck, etc. And you just go, right, this ship, these guns, this range, generate, and it'll give you a beautiful little deck and belt penetration profile, or even as you say, a full profile dependent on range. That would be really, really good. It would probably take a while to program, and it would require an understanding of the program itself, which is probably, understanding of naval penetration data and understanding of modern computer programming is very, very small overlap of people, but it'd be an absolutely wonderful thing to do. Incidentally, if anyone does have those particular skills and thinks they could have a fair crack at it, then drop me a line, and then I'll try and drop a line to Mr. Oken and try and get something sorted out permissions-wise, but you just have to see how it goes, because that would be so useful. I suspect there's like a non-animated version of that running in the background of some games, like World of Warships or War Thunder, or maybe not using those exact equations, but something close to. Frank Spazzato says, can you please make a video that explains what we were seeing in each frame of Barham's sinking? Feels a little bit voyeuristic to me, maybe. I can certainly add it to the list for consideration. I do want to do a video on Barham's sinking at some point. Whether I'll do a frame-by-frame through of the sinking and the explosion, I'm not entirely sure, but something about Barham's sinking will come in at some point in the future, for certain. X Shadow 1904 asks, will there be a longer video on the SMS Emden anytime soon? Again, it is on the list of Wednesday videos. Exactly when that's going to be produced, I'm not entirely sure. I do have my work cut out for me with trying to gradually shuffle things in with the Nelson Part 3.1, Part 3.2, the Trafalgar campaign and Trafalgar raid, because I've got to get that done by October, and oh boy, is the work stacking up on that. Jake Miller asks, would it have been better for the US Navy and the US in general to not do the Doolittle raid and have 4 carriers available for Coral Sea? I mean, on paper, yes, in theory, but then on the other hand, given that Lexington got plastered, Yorktown got badly hit, there's also a possible case that having 4 carriers at Coral Sea means 4 sunk and or damaged carriers. I mean, not all sunk, but sunk and damaged, which may not actually be a net negative for Midway. But conversely, you might have done a lot more damage to the Japanese carrier air group, so who knows? It's something that would have to be war-gamed out quite extensively. There's also the fact, the Doolittle raid, whilst in and of itself obviously didn't accomplish a tremendous amount, it did prompt the Japanese to pull resources inwards to a fair degree, so you'd have to also compare, without those resources being pulled inwards and a slightly more cautious approach to things, what would those resources, if the Japanese had those available in 42, be able to do? So it's all over the place on that one. There's probably a decent paper in that. And Sebastian Stoltz asking a similar question, any way to make the Doolittle raids more impactful in terms of damage done to Japan? Not tremendously. You're limited on bomb load, you're limited on the type of aircraft. I mean, short of identifying something particularly important and kamikazing into it, which isn't really a USAF thing, yeah, there's not a tremendous amount that they could actually do more. I suppose maybe refitting them as torpedo bombers and going after something in harbour, but you'd be relying very much on luck at that point to catch something in harbour and hitting it correctly with a relatively limited number of aircraft. William Kiefer, have you ever met the Mighty Jingles before? Yes, multiple times. Monkey of the Smack 419, when are we getting Lord Nelson's third video? October the 5th, or closest release date there on 2, actually. What is October this year? Oh, October the 5th is a Wednesday, so yeah, well done. You're getting it on October the 5th. Brandon Judge, when will you be coming to see USS The Sullivans? Possibly early June on my Canada trip, because it's literally just across the border. But that's a maybe. I have to see how the logistics, etc. works out. Andrew Cruz, using the hindsight of US battleships and mostly used for shore bombardment, would you modify their armour layout, and what would you do with the extra displacement that may afford you? Not really. I wouldn't modify the armour layout, because they mostly were used for shore bombardment. I mean, South Dakota's armour was there to protect her against Kirishima, and there were a lot of circumstances where the tiniest butterfly could have ended up with US battleships facing a full-on straight-up battle line engagement. Obviously, Surigao Strait, but that's more of an execution than a battle line. So, yeah. The problem is, so many of those engagements or non-engagements turned on such small probabilities that the simple act of having a different armor layout and therefore different capabilities to the US ships might be enough to change it so they actually end up in a straight up fight, and that therefore is not going to go so well. Their armor layout's pretty solid. What would I do with any extra displacement? I mean, the thing is, it's also useful for standing up to shore-based guns, and they were pretty covered in AA guns as it was. So yeah, I don't think although it's tempting, I don't think I would do all that much in terms of modifying their armor layout because they're doing shore bombardment. If I could use hindsight, I could go back and modify their armor layout in other ways to make it slightly more efficient, because there were a few flaws in some of the design schemes, but I wouldn't be lessening it. Boat Boy asking, has there been an update on the USS Sullivan's condition while you've been away? Well, yeah, as you know, I released a video with Ryan shortly after she sank, and as far as I'm aware, she was relatively recently back up, sitting on the water, patched up, so hopefully she stays afloat for the minute. Yes, as far as I'm aware, she spent some time underwater. She's now been refloated, and I think they're assessing the condition internally, like what internal damage has it done to exhibits, artifacts, the ship itself, etc., etc. Okay, so I think I'm probably going to start wrapping things up there, because I'm getting... Okay, you're just annoying. Sorry, someone's just trolling. I'm going to just get rid of them. There we go. That makes things much better. Right, I'll do like 2 or 3 more questions and then we're going to wrap up. So I can get some sleep and continue to recover from a vicious assault of mid-east US East Coast pollen. Galdi, Iona, we're going to get a video on those interwar Pacific pirates anytime soon. That might take a while. The broad outlines of how they operated are there, and I know them, but to turn it into an interesting Wednesday video might take a little bit of a stretch. I think I'll probably have to go and dig up Eagle and Hermes's interwar logs if they're still around in the National Archives, and then I can incorporate some of the details from their counter-piracy operations. That'll probably enliven it a little bit. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do says, are you scuba trained or do you wish to be in the future? I used to be, but I think any certification I have has long since lapsed. I was going to do a renewal course. Weirdly enough, I was going to do a renewal course in... I was supposed to do a renewal course in April 2020. I put that off because, of course, I thought I was going to be traveling to the US. So I had that rebooked for, I think, late May, early June 2020. Then, of course, the pandemic happened. None of that was possible. So, yeah, I think I pretty much have to start from scratch, especially because when I originally was scuba trained, it was all on hire equipment. So, I'd need to get my own equipment, or at least my own wetsuit and dry suit, because I want to do the advanced open water stuff so I can go down to, I think it's 40 meters. But yeah, I want to get that all back in again at some point. Obviously I've got to find somewhere in the UK that is now open and training scuba divers, which will be quite fun. Craig Jovanovic, have you done much research on the Chinese Navy? I've done as much as I can. I've done a fair bit of digging into the Chinese Steam Navy, i.e. the Imperial Chinese Navy, such as it was the one that fought at Yalu River, etc. There's not a tremendous amount to learn, at least to my eyes, about war junks, the kind of stuff that got blown up in the Opium Wars. But the latter 19th century Chinese war fleet is actually quite interesting, right up until the point it basically ceases to be. William Beckman, generally during World War II, how close would Allied forces operate to the coast of, per se, France? How much did coastal naval defence proliferate on the coast? If we're assuming France, while France is occupied, they could operate pretty up close and personal, i.e. within sight of the coastline. but it depends on the time of day. At night, they could operate very, very close. During the day, obviously, while France is still occupied, they're on the closer to coastal France they are, the more at risk of attack from the Luftwaffe they are, and also the fewer options they have if they come under U-boat attack, and coastal U-boats are definitely a thing. So yeah, they would bet the Allied forces would run in and out of the coast. They stand off at a distance during the day, and then they dash in, usually at night, with radar and just, do what they need to do, whether that was go after blockade runners, coastal forces, special forces operations, etc. But yeah, the coastal defences, much as Hitler wanted the Atlantic Wall to be impregnable, there were huge sections of the coast of France that basically didn't have any direct coastal defences that could reach out and hurt a ship. They might have had like a machine gun bunker somewhere or other, but you're not going to do anything to a cruiser that's 2 miles offshore with that. The man formerly known as commenting is what I do. Says scuba certification doesn't expire, so you should be still good to go diving. Yeah, it's more of a personal thing, because I got the scuba qualifications years and years and years ago, basically because I felt like it. But I haven't done regular scuba diving, so I wouldn't feel safe. I would feel I would be putting myself at risk and others at risk if I was just to throw myself back into the sea. What, 6-7 years after I last scuba dived, and just go motoring on down to the bottom? I'd want to build up again from starting from scratch to make sure everything is absolutely spot on. Plus, obviously, I'd want to get some of my own equipment to get used to it. So, if there's one thing as a naval historian you learn to respect, is to be very, 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 very careful when you're under the ocean. Otherwise, it will kill you, assuming the local wildlife doesn't get you. So, yeah, I'm definitely going to recertify from scratch. Mm-hmm. Yeah, people pointing out getting hold of actual original Chinese records is pretty difficult. Right, so I think last 2 questions then. Now being waved at off screen. Joseph Nielsen says, Drag, I sense we in the US have an inflated view of the power and invincibility of the Iowas. Do you think this may be true of the UK and HMS Hood? Well, since Hood exploded, I think most people in the UK do have some idea of the limits of the power and invincibility of Hood. With the US and the Iowas, yeah, some people do have a slightly overblown idea of their capabilities. But to be fair, there's also a lot of people who are much more realistic about it. Certainly none of the curators and docents and staff on the ships that I went on were, massively over ambitious about what their ship's capabilities were. They were perfectly aware of what they could do and what they couldn't do. It's just that there's an awful lot that they could do, and they were rightfully proud of that. So yeah, I think there's probably a pop culture, pop history perception of the Iowas that's a bit overinflated. But that's kind of the thing with most ships that are a subject of a fair degree of national pride. And also, there's also degrees of overinflation because, like say take one of the other ships I visited, USS Constitution. She's got an excellent track record, and some of the other of the 6 frigates also have excellent track records. So, someone who says, well, Constitution could beat any other frigate afloat, I'd argue that, but I can also see where they're coming from. And certainly I would give Constitution good odds against any contemporary frigate afloat that she fought. I just wouldn't necessarily say it was guaranteed she could beat any of them. But she certainly would have a good fighting chance against them. But see, that's the kind of thing over inflation where it's like, well, if we talked about it, we'd probably come to pretty much the same conclusion. But as a general rule of thumb, it's not wrong, even if it's not completely correct. And then there's the kind of USS Constitution could beat HMS Victory kind of people, at which point it's like no, that's not how these things work. So, and yeah, as I say, hopefully the people who are so badly misinformed or blinkered that they have the kind of really overinflated sense of how things go, well, they probably haven't opened a book in many years, so I'm not too fussed about them. They can go over there and have their opinions. Right. Let's go to one last question. Which one shall it be? Okay, I'll go with this one because I've seen this one percolating its way through. BR Class 47, nice locomotive. Somehow the Dutch 1920 Naval Commission recommended getting battleships mixed with the 1047 plan, and the Dutch... The Dutch get the Tosa BB-47 HMS Tiger 1913 second hand, and the Dutch put 13.5-inch guns on it. How does the Dutch Navy do in World War II? Horribly confused. If they've got a Tosa, well, I'm guessing what that means, a Tosa with 13.5-inch guns, BB-47 with 13.5-inch guns, and HMS Tiger. I mean, that's three very different ships with three very different speeds, different levels of armour, different levels of protection. The Dutch probably spend most of the interwar period crying into their cornflakes about the horrific levels of non-interoperability. And, I mean, to be brutally honest, the Japanese probably just saturate them with aircraft on day one of the war. But if they're lucky, some of them might escape. Then you've got ABDA command. But then what do the Japanese throw against them? It's kind of like with Prince of Wales and Repulse. In theory, they massively strengthen the ABDA command. In practice, the Japanese probably just put their own battleships on face-off against them. I suspect, given the record of Dutch shipping generally in the Second World War, that maybe one of them would survive. One would be very badly damaged, and one would be sunk. I suspect of those that the 13.5-inch derivative fitted Tosa might be the one that lives because of the combination of speed and durability. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that is probably going to be it for tonight. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for listening in, and thank you very much to those of you who came out to see me while I was on the US tour. As I say, we'll be doing another live stream, all things being equal, hopefully on the 21st, which will be questions straight from the chat, rather than, because obviously we've gone through all the Patreon questions, etc. So there'll be those questions, and also it'll be a more general, wider reflection on the US trip. So if you've got lots of questions about the US trip, that's a very good time to ask them. So that is that. I'm going to go and find some sleep, and I will see you again at some point in another video. Bye bye.